Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today and welcome back for day 2 of the online symposium, Drawn to Blue, co-organized by the J. Paul Getty Museum and the University of Amsterdam. My name is Michelle Sullivan, and I am Associate Conservator of Drawings at the Getty, one of the symposium organizers, along with Adina Adam, Assistant Curator for Drawings at the Getty, and Leila Savage, Paper Conservator and faculty member at the University of Amsterdam. Yesterday, we were treated to some really interesting presentations and some really good questions were raised related to the study of blue paper. Today, we're really looking forward to continuing in that vein and delving even deeper. Today's program, much like yesterday, is organized into 3 parts. The first 2 parts are sessions of presentations, and we'll conclude with a roundtable discussion, inviting all of our symposium presenters back. Just a little bit of housekeeping and setting the scene. At the start of each session today, the moderator will introduce all of the speakers, then the presentations will follow, and we will conclude with a 10-minute Q&A period before taking a 15-minute break. We do ask you to submit all of your questions using Zoom's Q&A function, not the chat function. This will help us keep track of the questions a little bit easier. And just a note that the presentations are being recorded with just a couple of exceptions, and they will be posted to the Getty's website after the program. It may take a little bit of time, but all symposium registrants will receive notice when the recordings are available online. And with that, I'm very pleased to introduce our first session of the day, technical case studies. We have 3 presentations in this session. The first is presented by Georg Dietz, called On Blue, the portrait drawings of Ottavio Leoni. Georg is the head of conservation and deputy director at the Kupferkabinet at the Stedelijk Museum zu Berlin. He holds a diploma degree in conservation on the art of paper from the State Academy of Art and Design at Stuttgart. He has a strong focus on the study concerns of art technology. Our second presentation will have 2 speakers, Annegret Seeger and Max Ehrengruber. Presentation is Out of the Blue, Tracing Object Biographies, Early Conservation Treatments, and the Original Appearance of Italian Old Master Drawings on Blue Paper at the Kunstmuseum Basel. Annegret studied paper conservation at the Cologne Institute of Conservation Science and worked there as a scientific assistant since 2015, the paper conservator at Kunstmuseum Basel. Max studied photography at Zurich University of the Arts and art history at University of Zurich. He's currently working as a scientific photographer at Kunstmuseum Basel's Department of Conservation. And our third presentation in this session will be by Tom Primo of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Tom's paper is entitled Blue Paper in Late 19th Century Paris, Marie Cassat's Pastel Supports. Tom is currently the Charles K. Williams II Senior Conservator of Works on Paper at the PMA. Before joining PMA, he served as Senior Conservator at National Archives and as Director of Conservation and Paper Conservator at the Baltimore Museum of Art. And with that, I will hand over the virtual podium to Georg to start this session. Georg?
Thanks, Michelle. Okay, thanks, Michelle, for the kind introduction, and thanks for the invitation to speak here. The topic of this talk are the portrait drawings of the 17th century Roman painter and portraitist Ottavio Leoni in the collection of the Kupferstichkabinett Berlin. The project was started back in 2010 when Francesco Solinas and Yuri Primarosa began their research for a catalogue. From 2012 on, all the Berlin drawings were intensively analyzed in an interdisciplinary project involving art history, art technology, paper history, and conservation science. We made use of scanning XRF and microfading testing. Involved in the project were Dagmar Korbacher, curator in charge and today director of the Kupferstichkabinett Berlin, Stefan Röhrs, chemist and deputy director of the Radgen Research Laboratory of the Berlin State Museums, and Carlos Merino Morales, natural scientist and by then research fellow at the Radgen Laboratory. First, let me introduce you to Ottavio Leoni, here a presumed self-portrait at the age of about 15 or 16. Ottavio was born in Rome in 1578. He received his first training from his father, the painter Lodovico Leoni from Padua. Ottavio created numerous altarpieces for churches in Rome and was a member and later president of the Accademia di San Luca, of which Lorenzo was referring yesterday. Leoni worked not only as a painter, but also as a draftsman and engraver during the early Baroque period in Rome. There he died as a celebrated portraitist in 1630. The Kupferstichkabinett Berlin houses a number of 89 portrait drawings by Leoni. They were created in Rome between 1593 and 1629. They include examples from all over his career, providing an excellent base for a comprehensive and representative study. The drawings have all a handy format of about 24 to 17 centimeters and show predominantly distinguished ladies and gentlemen from the Roman society in individual portraits. Leoni always portrayed them on blue ground, using natural black and white chalk, as well as in later works red chalk and other colored chalks. All these drawings derive from the collection of the Roman sculptor Vincenzo Pacetti and entered the Berlin collection in 1843. The white paper frames surrounding each drawing are the remnants of late 18th century album pages. Leoni was especially renowned for his exquisite and lively portraits. 1642, his colleague and biographer Giovanni Baglione writes, "There was hardly anyone in Rome who did not have their portrait painted by Ottavio, whether prince, princess, nobleman, or other person of status. There was no house in which a portrait of the Cavaliere's hand did not hang." Here you can see a portrait drawing showing Cardinal Scipio Borghese and a related painting. Leoni's early portraits from the years 1595 to 1600, 1602 are drawn on blue prepared paper. Scanning XRF revealed a very high homogeneous lead content, indicating the use of lead white. No evidence of an inorganic blue pigment could be found. Therefore, can be assumed that Leoni used an organic blue pigment, most probably indigo. Indigo was frequently used as a blue colorant in 17th century painting. Various treatises recommend mixing it with a white pigment, for example lead white, in order to lighten the very dark, almost black hue as required. Other tracts warn against the use of indigo, as this dye tends to fade. This might be already noticed in the lower middle. With this example, you can perceive the broad brush strokes and slightly uneven application of the blue ground. And I try to show it with the mouse. Here you can see the brush strokes. From 1602 onwards, Leoni stopped preparing paper and made instead use of variegated blue papers. XRF revealed no indication for the use of inorganic pigments. The blue color derives obviously from blue rags used for paper making, most likely dyed with indigo deriving from woad. Since we have seen so many discolored blue papers, starting with Mariah's talk yesterday, nobody will be surprised to see more gray to brown and greenish instead of blue papers on this slide. Please focus on the last drawing in the lower row. This drawing of a young man shows a very unregular discoloration and paper browning on recto and verso. The color difference is even perceptible in areas where the drawing is glued behind the old album paper. This might be taken as a proof that the discoloration is quite old and had taken place even before mounting the drawing in the late 18th century. You can see it up here, for example. From the year 1600 onwards, Leoni dated his drawings, and from January 1615 on, the year he became president of the Accademia di San Luca, he additionally numbered them consecutively and noted down the months of creation. This allows us to precisely sort the drawings by date of creation, as you can see on the slide, trace the artist's output, and observe his growing choice of chalks, starting with red chalk from the year 1619 onwards, an example here, and leading to fabricated chalks containing, for example, vermilion. An example would be this drawing or this one over here. The portrait of Cengia Tedesca is an example of a dated and numbered drawing. We can read 1618 down in the middle, the number 112 and the month Julio for July, and a detail taken from here shows the quality of the variegated blue paper with the blue yarn that survived paper making process here. If we compare the effect of the natural black chalk on blue prepared paper on the left versus variegated blue paper on the right, we notice on the left a much denser, more compact and cast shadowish, even Caravaggesque look, whereas on the right we observe a lighter, more flighty and vivid impression. So it might have been an artistic decision to change from prepared to unprepared blue paper. Of course, we have checked all the drawings for the presence of watermarks. In 77 portraits from the unprepared series, we have found 21 marks, which can be grouped to 8 discernible motifs, 2 of which most probably form a pair of molds. They are all published and pictured in the 2013 Leoni catalogue, edited by Francesco Solinas. It is striking that for none of the watermarks an identical example could be found in the relevant literature or watermark databases online. In a historic paper collection from Fabriano, however, identical motifs were found, but they all differ in size or shape of details and are all dated earlier, sometimes by decades, than Leoni's drawings. It should be noted that the reference of watermarks are generally taken from dated archival documents, nearly all written on white writing paper, not blue paper. As we heard already yesterday in various talks, there are indications that blue papers were sometimes produced on molds that were discarded after years of use for the production of white paper. In this context, I would like to draw your attention to this specific watermark we found in a very discolored paper. It shows a 6-pointed star in script in a quatrefoil in a circle. By accident, it is present in another very well preserved drawing on blue variegated paper in the Kupferstichkabinett collection, dated 5 years earlier than Leoni's portrait and made by the artist Francesco Vanni, very likely in Rome. I owe thanks to my former colleague Cordula Severit, who systematically documented the watermarks in the collection over many years. Here we go. In transmitted light, we can see the even formation with only little inclusions of this half sheet of an Italian Reale format. In this digital overlay, we can see that most likely both papers, Leoni's and Vanni's, were casted on the same mold. The gray font indicates the original size of the half sheet, and the red boxes show that Leoni didn't use the paper very economically. The discolored condition of many Leoni portrait drawings, some on blue prepared paper on the left, many on blue variegated paper on the right, made us interested in aging and fading effects. So microfading testing was performed at Röntgen Research Laboratory Berlin with an Oriel xenon fading tester. First of all, historic samples of blue variegated paper were tested. After that, a selection of 3 drawings by Leoni was made. 1 example on blue prepared paper and 2 on blue, respectively brown discolored variegated blue paper. Light exposure rate was 10 megalux hours per hour. No UV. Spot size was limited to 0.4 millimeters. Exposure time limited to 30 minutes. As a reference, blue wool standards 1 to 5 were measured, 1 to 3 regarded as highly sensitive by CEIE. On the y-axis, up here, you can read the CLAB color difference delta E, and we remember that delta E1, that would be here, is defined as first noticeable difference to the human eye. X-axis gives the time of fading testing in minutes. Looking at the reflectance spectrum down here of blue wool 1, it is very interesting to note that after fading, that is the white graph in script, blue and red tones diminish, whereas green and yellow are getting more intense. This is, in a way, what we perceive when looking at light-aged blue papers that have turned greenish to brownish. The fading test results for the Leoni drawing on prepared blue paper show 7 measurements combined in one graph. Delta E1 is reached after 5.5 minutes, and after 30 minutes, delta E reaches 2.5. Compared with the graph of blue wool 3, you see here, the blue preparation of Leoni's paper turns out to be even slightly more sensitive. Looking at blue variegated paper, always a little bit more tricky to measure because of the inhomogeneous fiber distribution, we have an orange graph for the tested brown discolored areas. Here. And a green one for the better preserved blue areas. Both align each other more or less. Delta E1 is reached after 3 minutes. After 30 minutes, delta E is about 2.7 or 8. Again, the paper is slightly more sensitive than blue wool standard 3, given in blue for comparison. And we note that already brown discolored areas are still prone to change. Altogether, discoloration in this survey went faster with blue variegated paper. We had a short discussion what chemical reaction could have taken place. The first option, a reduction of indigo in presence of iron 2 ions that would trigger the formation of transparent to yellowish leuco-indigo is not very likely, since this molecule should be oxidized very soon in reaction with oxygen in the air to indigo again. More likely is to consider an oxidation of indigo molecules in the presence of ozone to also yellowish but stable isetene. Coming back to Leoni, we can draw the following conclusion. The different discoloration or lack of discoloration is not necessarily due to a different composition of the paper, as these partially altered drawings prove. Both the blue prepared papers as well as the different blue variegated papers are, as analysis shows, all highly sensitive to light. The observed discolorations can therefore obviously be attributed to inappropriate storage or presentation conditions. These must date back, as pointed out earlier, even before the album mounting of the 18th century. In this respect, the inventory of possessions drawn up shortly after Ottavio Leoni's death is revealing. It reports that in addition to paintings, some drawings were laying out openly on tableaus, and some were also framed on the wall. However, it is not clear from the reports whether these frames were glazed or only consisted of simple wooden frame strips. The accumulation of fly dirt of numerous discolored sheets of paper, however, suggests an open, unglazed presentation over a long period. Completely unaffected by the mentioned discoloration phenomena are those drawings in the Berlin collection dating from 1617 onwards. These portraits, which already paved the way for pastel painting with colored chalks on blue paper, were evidently very carefully preserved from the beginning on, and have retained the original bright blue paper tone. The faces of the sitters look as if they have been freshly powdered and dabbed with rouge, an effect that could only be achieved on the somewhat coarser textured blue variegated papers, as they provide sufficient support for the friable chalk pigments. These drawings still bear witness to Ottavio Leoni's masterly portrait art. Thank you very much for listening. We are happy to receive your questions or input later on. For now, I would like to welcome Annegret and pass the word on to her.
So thank you, Georg, and thank you very much, Michelle, for the introduction. And we would like to thank the organizing team of the symposium. I'm going straight to our presentation out of the blue, and we would like to share with you a case study about two heavily faded drawings by Giovanni Bonatti at the Kunstmuseum Basel. Our main focus was the object biography, looking into the light sensitivity of the blue paper, followed by the reconstruction of their original appearance. The Kupferstichkabinett of the Kunstmuseum Basel holds more than 240 Italian drawings from the 16th to the 18th century. Around 30 drawings are on blue. Here on the left, a glimpse at our database. The blue paper quality of these drawings varies from fine to coarse, and the hues range from light blue to brownish. Represented are artists like Francesco Zuccarelli, Giulio Romano, Luca Cambiaso, and Donato Creti. But the main focus of our case study are these two chalk drawings, attributed to Giovanni Bonatti on the right, and they are heavily faded, as you can see, but along the edges, they still provide clues to the original blue color of the paper. The painter Giovanni Bonatti lived in the 17th century, was apprenticed in Bologna to the studio of Guercino, and he joined the studio of Pier Francesco Mola. Just a small number of his paintings and drawings had survived. Some of these drawings, as you can see in the middle, are also on blue paper. As far as we know, the most comprehensive collection is held by the Uffizi with 28 drawings, and one of them here on the right. And you see the subject is similar to that of our drawings. Our drawings came to the Kupferstichkabinett in 1941 with a large collection of prints and drawings from the Hendman Horner Foundation. Unfortunately, there is no further documentation about the condition of the drawings from the time. So now let's focus on one of his drawings in our collection, the kneeling male nude. Based on the window mat, we can assume that the drawing was newly mounted by the bookbinder at the Kunstmuseum in the 40s or 50s. The cutout of the window mat does not show at first sight that the paper was originally blue. Let's take a closer look. Here on the right, an almost 1 centimeter wide strip is still visible. The overmatted window is not aligned with the faded area, which means the paper must have faded already before it was placed in this mount. Also interesting are the historic paper toned infills at the top edge, matching the already faded blue paper hue. Somewhat surprising is the mounting when you open the window mat. The drawing is remounted with a false margin made of modern blue paper. So the question arose if the overlapping blue mounting could have protected the edges of the drawing from fading. The blue paper on the verso is still unfaded, and the toned infills matching the recto are clearly visible. Here is a close-up of the verso. The modern blue paper covers around 4 millimeters of the drawing paper, here marked in green. So the overlap of the false margin does not match the unfaded still blue edges of the recto. This means the false margin didn't protect the edges of the recto from fading. Clearly visible is our collection mark, covered by the false margin, which shows the mount was made at the Kunstmuseum. And also interesting is the red wax-like residue, and once we went deeper into the research, we found the historic supports of both drawings in an archive folder. They are made of very thick cardboard, it's almost 6 millimeters, and also visible the red waxy residues along the edges. The matching red residue show that the drawing was mounted on the cardboard. On the right, you see the back of the board with the brand mark of the Constabulary collection from the 19th century. We assume that the drawings even came to the museum framed and only the boards were kept. In some of the holes, remnants of insects were found, here on the right. This ties in with the visible silverfish damage on the back, which you can see on the left. Holes with irregular thinned edges, like the one on the label, are the typical damage pattern for silverfish. This led us to the course of the holes in the paper of the drawing. Here you see a close-up image of an infill. The infill is toned according to the faded paper hue. The whole course by the silverfish is surrounded by grazed edges that still show the underlying blue paper fibers. The grazing surface damage therefore occurred after the fading of the drawing. So we assume that the bookbinder expected the grazed edges to fade over time too. Looking at the top edge, there are also elaborate infills. And as you can see, the infill paper is toned to fit the recto, which is why it does not match the unfaded verso. The infill was chamfered along the edges for a smooth transition between the infill and the original paper. This is visible on the verso. A close-up shows that even in the faded part, some very dark blue fibers are still clearly visible. Some of the fibers are therefore more sensitive to light than others, resulting in the reduced intensity of the perceived color. And in comparison, the verso shows an even darker blue hue. Having seen many faded blue papers, we assumed the blue paper color to be highly fugitive, so we decided to confirm this by testing the drawing with a microfading tester. So I think it's quite similar to Georg's device, but we have LED. So the microfading tester is an analytic device to determine the light sensitive of an artwork. The device is based on the assumption that light-induced changes are cumulative. A small dose of light over a long time has the same influence as a high dose over a short time. The tester works by exposing a tiny spot of less than 1 millimeter to high intensity light while continuously measuring the color spectrum with a spectrophotometer and calculating the color change delta E. To compare results, the Blue Wool standard is used as a reference. It is a common standard in textile industry and consists of 8 wool swatches, which each fade after a standardized dose of light exposure. The most sensitive, here on the top, is Blue Wool 1, and Blue Wool 8 is the most stable. For microfading testing of works of art on paper, only the most sensitives, Blue Wool 1 to 3, are relevant. And you can see the fading curves on the slide. This means we can categorize measurements of colorants or papers as equivalent to a certain Blue Wool standard. As mentioned before, our expectation was that the blue paper in general is extremely light sensitive. So we expected the blue paper on the verso to be around Blue Wool 1. As color change normally is most pronounced at the beginning of light exposure, we also assumed to see a distinct difference between the faded areas on the recto and the non-faded blue verso. To compare results, the blue standard is used as a reference. Oh no, wrong slide, sorry. So here you can see several measurements of the blue verso and faded recto of Bonatti's kneeling male nude. There is indeed a distinction of the fading curves between the verso and the recto. But the blue paper, while definitely being in the high light sensitive range, is not as light sensitive as we expected. The reason for this might be that not all factors influencing the fading rate can be simulated by the microfading tester. For example, our microfading tester does not include UV light. But also the presence of pollutant, high humidity or temperature can't be simulated during the tests. The heavy fading on the recto means that the work was exposed to bright light for a long period. But we don't know if other factors helped speed up the fading process. After seeing these results, we were curious how they compare to other blue-colored papers in our collection. We measured the second drawing by Bonatti at the Kunstmuseum, The Dead Christ, and it yielded very similar results on the faded recto and the unfaded verso as the kneeling male nude. On the top right, you see 2 other Italian drawings on blue paper from the 16th century. These as well as some blue paper samples also showed fading curves around blue wood too. Our conclusion is that the drawings can be exhibited under our museum's condition without the risk of the blue margins on the verso fading visibly. The microfading test gives us an idea of possible future fading or changes. The artwork also provided a powerful glimpse into the past, what the original artwork once looked like, which Max will tell you more about it.
We wanted to know how the artist had originally conceived the artwork and how its appearance has already changed over time. Our interest arose from both a conservation and an art historical background, leading to a digital reconstruction. The unfaded areas serve as an excellent reference for the original blue hue of the paper, and to obtain accurate color information, we produced an extensive image set, including visible, ultraviolet light, and digital X-ray images. The question was where to apply or overlay the blue hue. Basically, we needed a selection of raw paper, excluding any drawing materials. To this selection, we would eventually apply the original hue. This turned out to be quite difficult. First, some of the various chalks used, ranging from black to white and red, brown to pink, are very similar in color to the faded paper tone. Therefore, we could not select the yellowish-brown faded paper tone, as this would have falsely rendered some drawing materials blue in the reconstruction. Second, the chalks varied significantly in opacity and density. This is why we could not make a selection based merely on the density range shown in the X-ray images. In addition, the superimposed verso drawing complicated this approach. Comparing the visible light with the UV light image, we observed that a difference in luminescence clearly indicates drawing lines, white chalk under the microscope, and wiping marks which had been obscured under the visible light. At the same time, the UV image also shows staining, which makes reconstruction based on the UV image alone unsuitable. Still, looking at our multispectral images, it became clear that revealing visual information we needed is encoded in some kind of spectral way across the image dataset. We therefore employed a different technique to fuse the different spectral characteristics encoded in our obtained image data. Principal component analysis. This method reduces the dimensionality of its input data. It is typically used in machine learning and data compression in order to simplify complex data sets. In the context of image data, PCA can be used to identify significant spectral information by transforming the input image into principal components ordered by decreasing covariance. These components capture the most important features of the data, with the first components capturing the most defining spectral characteristics and subsequent components capturing progressively less important features. Ultimately, this allowed us to differentiate various materials. The PCA decodes the spectral information we found in both our visible light and UV images. This meant 6 dimensions as by the red, green, and blue color channel of the 2 input images. And these are the outputted 6 principal components displayed as monochrome images. The different principal components allow the differentiation of drawing materials based on their spectral characteristics. Cross-checking with the original, we identified the third principal component as the one that best corresponds to raw paper within our input data. On the left, you can see the mask made from the principal component 3, with white referring to raw paper and black to non-raw paper. This is the current state of the artwork, and this is the blue hue applied through the mask of principal component 3. Let's zoom into some regions of interest. This is our digital reconstruction. Looking at the arm, you see a fine gradation of chalk on the light blue paper color that shines through the drawing. Also note the white chalk lines in the lower right corner. These are very similar in tone to the faded paper and a good example of why we could not simply select the faded paper color for our reconstruction. Using PCA, the lines are clearly visible now. Compared to the status quo, and again, this is our reconstruction. Let's also look at the top left corner in detail. This is our reconstruction, and in comparison to the status quo, and again, our reconstruction. If you compare the reconstruction with the Verso, you can see how much more intense the blue must have been at one time. Therefore, we applied another color shift using spectrometric measurements from the Verso in order to derive our final digital reconstruction. And this is our final reconstruction, compared to the status quo on the right. We found principal component analysis to be a great non-invasive imaging tool to give an idea of the original appearance of the drawing. This was relatively low technical effort as we were able to use our own image data and open source software, in this case Hoku. This drawing proved to work very well because of its spectral variance, but the technique might not be as suitable for other objects with constant reflection across a broad spectral range. It is important to keep in mind that PCA does not serve as a material analysis, as it is only partially transparent as to what is being transformed here. Results of PCA are highly dependent on the properties of its input data, but it proved to be a great tool of visualization purposes in our first experimental application. Finally, studying our two drawings, we noticed signs that indicated that they were originally part of a sketchbook. On the Verso of Dead Christ, here on the right, is an offset of colored chalks showing a study of a model. This missing drawing might look something like this. We therefore are looking for further drawings on blue or already faded paper by Giovanni Bonatti, which may also belong to our sketchbook sequence. In conclusion, the case study of these two Bonatti drawings has allowed us to gain a deeper understanding of the material properties, as well as the aesthetic qualities of these works and how they have changed over time. We'd like to thank our team and colleagues and all the supportive people of our project, and thanks a lot for your attention. I will be happy to pass on to Tom now.
Thank you. Before I begin, my co-author Kate Duffy, senior scientist at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and I would like to thank the conference organizers for accepting our contribution. Though our subject is a case study of blue paper later than 1800, we hope that our research will complement the excellent studies of earlier blue paper presented at the symposium. This discussion examines Mary Cassatt's artistic materials and techniques, focusing on her choice of pastel supports, and particularly her use of blue paper. It will report the results of chemical analysis and microscopic examination of well-preserved fiber samples taken from an 1898 Cassatt pastel. These findings explore the extent that changes in papermaking technology in the 19th century may have impacted a traditional artist material blue paper. Our research began in preparation for the exhibition Mary Cassatt at Work, presented at the Philadelphia Museum of Art last May through September. The exhibition is currently on view at the Legion of Honor in San Francisco through January 26, 2025. It changed my life, wrote Mary Cassatt, recalling her first sight of the pastels by Edgar Degas in the window of a Parisian picture dealer in 1875. I used to go and flatten my nose against that window and absorb all that I could see of his art, she remembered. Cassatt had handled pastels earlier, but would not take them up with a passion until 1878. And by the end of her career, the medium would become her favorite, used for her final work in 1914. A few years after he first drew her attention, Degas invited Cassatt to join the group of independents, known more commonly as the Impressionists, in their fourth show, which would take place in the spring of 1878. In anticipation of the exhibition, Cassatt responded to the model that Degas had set in pastel. The Catalogue raisonné of Cassatt's pastels lists 379 works, the majority of which were executed on paper mounted to a strainer or board. For her debut in the 1878 Salon des Independents, however, she presented at the theater, a pastel executed on canvas. Catalogues for contemporary manufacturers of artist materials, including the Parisian firms Lefranc and Sennelier, list the size and cost of canvases specially primed with gritty layers containing sand, marble, or pumice to create a rough surface to capture pastel. The dull brown tone of At the Theater's canvas suggests that it was prepared with pumice. In addition to the unusual canvas support, At the Theater shows Cassatt's experimental use of pastel. Degas' technical influence is apparent as Cassatt layers and manipulates her pastels with water and finishes her composition with brush-applied passages of shimmering gold-colored paint. An X-radiograph reveals that before Cassatt commenced drawing with pastel, she created a foundation for the prominently displayed fan with a thick fluid paint, which registers in the X-ray image as a dense, brush-applied white field. It is also noteworthy around the same time Cassatt was exploring the medium of distemper, paint formulated by dispersing pigments in warm glue, which dries rapidly, resulting in an opaque matte surface. Several of Cassatt's contemporaries, including Vuillard, Redon, and of course Degas, also worked in distemper, occasionally in combination with pastel. Cassatt returns to canvas as a pastel support only 3 other times in her career. Most of her pastels are executed on paper, mounted to cloth, and stretched to a strainer, or paper mounted to board. Degas' practice for many of his chalk and pastel drawings was to work with restorers and framers to mount his papers onto boards, such as these 2 works in the PMA. On the left is a study of 2 dancers in chalk and charcoal on tracing paper that Degas had mounted overall to a board with 2 additional sections on which he may have planned to expand his composition. And on the right is a pastel of Mary Cassatt seen from the back, executed on light gray paper that was perimeter mounted to a heavyweight board. In Cassatt's practice, however, she purchased ready-made pastel supports directly from art suppliers. Vendors such as Sennelier offered felt-textured papers combined with canvas of various colors and in standard sizes. The pastel mother and child was done on paper that was commercially mounted to fabric and wrapped around a strainer. The reverse is stamped with the name of the Paris company F. Dupré, an artist material supplier from whom Cassatt obtained several of her canvases that she also used in oil painting. In her pastel practice, in which portraiture dominated, Cassatt shifts between 2 stylistic modes. The one presented in works such as the portrait of Garner Cassatt and Madame Bayard's Baby in a Striped Chair, where the entire support is covered with a layer of carefully blended pastel, and a looser, unfinished style, examples of which include Woman Arranging Her Veil and this portrait of Mabel Simpkins. Employing the sketchier, non-finis approach, Cassatt seems to capture her subjects in spontaneous and casual moments. Here, significant areas of the paper are reserved or left unworked. Today, the bare papers in these works have a dull, light brown tone, though it is generally presumed that Cassatt would have chosen cooler, blue-gray toned papers following the precedents set by 18th century practitioners who Cassatt admired, especially Rosalba Carriera and Maurice Quentin de la Tour. In their works, the blue or blue-gray paper provides a mid-tone that the artist could engage with, creating shimmering highlights or passages of rich saturated color. In portraiture, moreover, the cooler tones of the paper accentuated the warm palette that the artist employed to render flesh and to give life. The portrait of Mabel Simpkins is presently on a sheet of unmounted wool paper. However, close examination of the creased edge of the support indicates that it had once been wrapped around a strainer. Areas along the edge of the sheet where is folded along the side of the strainer have a cooler tonality than the warmer light brown that dominates the composition. The color shift of Cassatt's pastels from blue to brown has been attributed to the mechanization of papermaking in the 19th century, which saw the introduction of wood fibers and other additives to pulp slurries. Researchers on Cassatt's pastel papers assume that the alteration in paper tone is due, in part, to the use of synthetic aniline dyes, which were produced on a large scale in France as early as 1858. However, this conclusion is based on historical context rather than on chemical analysis of the papers. In the course of preparing works for the exhibition, Mary Cassatt at Work, fragments of Cassatt's pastel paper became available for analysis. The pastel Woman in a Black Hat and a Raspberry Pink Costume, on loan to the Philadelphia venue of the exhibition from a private collector, required the replacement of an old acidic backing board to better protect it. On examination, it was noted that the backing board, which was being held in place with masking tape, had been previously removed to access the reverse of the pastel and repair a tear in the support. This repair occurred before the work was acquired by the current owner, and there were no records to identify the restorer. However, it is apparent that when the board was taken off, patches of paper were pulled off the reverse of the strainer and remained attached to the adhesive which previously held the board in place. The owner of the pastel allowed the museum to retain the old backing board with the adhered paper fragments for study purposes. On areas of paper fragments where the surface had been skinned off, it is notable that the core of the paper has a cool blue-green tonality in contrast to the warmer light brown color of the paper surface. Under magnification, here is a section of the paper as seen in visible light taken using a video spectral comparator. The paper is found to be variegated with numerous thick, dark colored fibers. Blue fibers are predominant, but there are also many red, brown, orange, pink, magenta, purple, and colorless ones. Representative fibers were mechanically removed from the fragment and prepared for Fourier transform infrared microspectroscopy. The data were collected using a Bruker Lumos 2 microscope. The table describes the samples, their colors, and identities. The results show how several of the fibers to be proteinaceous, while others are cellulosic. A polyester fiber was identified. However, attempts to locate additional synthetic fibers could not be repeated, leading to the conclusion that the polyester fiber was a contaminant due to later handling of the paper fragment. A blue protein fiber was found to be colored with Prussian blue. This slide shows the transmission spectrum of the sample at the top, matching closely with a reference spectrum for protein in the middle and a reference spectrum for Prussian blue at the bottom. Note the characteristic peak at wave number 2083 in both the sample and the Prussian blue reference. Further identification of the protein fibers as wool was accomplished by examining several blue fibers using a Nikon Eclipse microscope. Here the samples, viewed in reflected light, exhibit the characteristic cylindrical shape and coarse surface scales of wool fibers. Prussian blue is an intense blue pigment invented in Germany around 1706 and was in wide use throughout Europe by the middle of the 18th century. In France, an industrial process used for dyeing wool with Prussian blue was developed around 1820 and extensively used throughout most of the century to dye fabric that was used for French military uniforms. A blue cellulosic fiber was found to be colored with indigo. This slide shows the transmission spectrum of the sample at the top, matching closely with a reference spectrum for cellulose in the middle and a reference spectrum for indigo at the bottom. Note the characteristic peaks at 1,626 and 3,246. Now, it should be noted that the blue dyestuffs indigo and woad share similar absorptions in FTIR. Further analysis by gas chromatography mass spectrometry would be required to confirm the identity as indigo. Refined identification of some of the cellulosic fibers as cotton was aided by microscopic examination. In this slide, showing a mixture of fiber types, the faint blue-shaped fiber with a tapered end at the right exhibits a flat and twisted ribbon shape characteristic of a cotton fiber. Now viewed under ultraviolet light, the bright blue fluorescence of the fiber indicates the presence of the indigo dye. The dyeing of cotton with indigo has a long history, and although the import and use of indigo in France varied throughout the 19th century, it is unlikely that there would have been any shortage of dyed indigo rags available for paper making. Returning to the view of this section of the paper using the video spectral comparator, one can appreciate the range of different fiber types, their colors, sizes, and textures. Viewing the sample through an infrared filter, a dark blue fiber near the center of the sample takes on a dark black appearance, again suggesting the presence of Prussian blue, which absorbs infrared radiation. Seen under ultraviolet light, the fluorescence of bright blue, yellow, and red fibers attests to the wide variety of rag sources that were recycled to produce this paper. The frequent appearance of fibers fluorescing faint blue indicates the high percentage of wool fibers that were added to the pulp. Many of these blue glowing fibers appear to clear in visible light, suggesting that they were added to the paper pulp, not to enhance the color, but as a filler, which modified the bulk and texture of the paper to make it more suitable for pastel work. The addition of wool fibers allowed for the formation of papers with a soft, microabrasive surface, which would readily accept fine pastel particles with the slightest pressure from the artist's hand and hold them secure within a fibrous network. Since this pastel by Cassatt was created in the late 19th century, one would expect that in addition to the wool and cotton fibers already noted, that the paper composition contained a variety of plant materials, including wood-derived fibers. Polarized light microscopy of fiber samples indicates that the presence of bast fibers, in this image apparent through diagonally through the center of the field, as a long cylindrical fiber with intervals of nodes and cross markings. Also present are long ribbon-like wood fibers with noticeable vessel elements and tapered ends. A sample of paper fibers treated with Graph C stain. Here, the yellow coloring indicates the presence of fiber with a high lignin content, such as wood, jute, leaf, or grass fibers. Fibers stained with a reddish coloring are those without lignin and may include cotton and bast fibers, such as linen, hemp, or flax. Non-destructive elemental analysis by X-ray fluorescence spectrometry of a small section of the paper was conducted using a Bruker tracer instrument. This image shows the spectra from the front and back of the sample combined, demonstrating that each side of the paper had a similar elemental profile. Here is a closer view of the spectra, highlighting the various elements that were detected. The nickel, rhodium, and palladium originate from the instrument, whereas argon originates from the atmosphere. Aluminum and silicon were detected, suggesting the presence of clay. Peaks on the spectra corresponding with calcium, potassium, strontium, and sulfur may represent the presence of calcite or gypsum. Clay, calcite, and gypsum are all materials that have been used as fillers in the manufacture of paper. The elements copper, zinc, mercury, lead, titanium, and manganese may have originated from the pigments within the pastel that Cassatt, and from the pastels that Cassatt used to create the portrait on the front of the support, and may have been transferred to the back of the paper through handling. Iron may also originate from an artist pigment or from the Prussian blue dyed fibers in the paper. Iron may also represent a contaminant introduced from the machinery used to macerate the pulp or form the paper sheets. Cassatt's pastel palette included chrome-based pigments, so the detection of chromium may be due to media transfer. However, in the late 19th century, chromium was used as a mordant for the synthetic dyes used to color fabrics and tone papers. Therefore, it is possible that the chromium in the Cassatt paper fragment originated from a dye introduced either to the pulp vat or applied to the paper after formation to intensify the blue tonality of the paper. An extensive range of colors were created using aniline dye technology. A page from an early 20th century sample book shows the many shades of blue that could be used to tone paper. Our research and analysis of Cassatt's pastel papers is ongoing, and one of the key objectives includes determining if other colorants such as aniline dyes are present. We also hope to identify the red, brown, orange, pink, magenta, and purple colorants observed in the paper fibers. The PMA's analytical lab is currently in the process of acquiring equipment for proteomics analysis, which can be used to identify the species from which the wool fibers originated, as well as the origin of protein sizing that was detected during FTIR analysis. This table summarizes the characteristics of the paper that Cassatt used for her 1898 pastel that we have determined to date. Decidedly modernist in her artistic practice, Cassatt's approach to pastel and her choice of paper reflects the influence that she drew from early practitioners. Although the type of paper available to her reflects how industrialization impacted the manufacture of artist materials, her use of blue tone paper ties her to the pastel traditions that date to the 18th century. This appreciation for blue paper in late 19th century France is echoed in Carl Robert's 1890 manual, Le Pastel, which recommends to aspiring pastelists that they simply use blue-gray paper. It is excellent, and many charming pastels from the 18th century are executed on light blue-gray paper. We would like to thank the colleagues listed here for lending their support and expertise to this study, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Tom, Georg, Annegret, and Max for those really interesting presentations. I now invite you all to come back, turn on your cameras and audio, as well as Rebecca Honhold, Annegret and Max's colleague, for a Q&A session. You guys were wonderfully on time, so we have 10 full minutes to answer some questions. I think I'll start with one for Georg, having to do with your mention of the fading of indigo in the papers of Leone. The question has to do with the chemical reactions, and were you merely speculating on what you think was occurring, or have you been pursuing analytical work to kind of investigate that more scientifically? Just curious, because it's a question that definitely came up during our project at the Getty as well. What exactly is happening?
Yeah, thank you for the question. In fact, we were speculating, and we made a trial with Fourier transformed infrared, but we had to see that the measurement of the paper was overlayering the measurement of indigo. So we could not really show that indigo or leuco-indigo are there. So we tried, but didn't succeed.
Certainly a difficult problem to explore with these papers. Thank you. Next question is for Annegret, Max, and Rebecca. Your virtual reconstructions were really wonderful, and it's a challenging thing to do. Definitely using the PCA was a very sophisticated approach to trying to visually reconstruct the faded blue paper. The question has to do with, to what state do you think you were bringing the drawings, restoring the drawings to? You were kind of using the verso, it seems, as the reference point. But do you feel that that's sort of the original state of the blue paper? You did mention in your MFT analysis that other reactions could be at play in addition to light fading. So just curious your thoughts about that. To what moment in the object's history do you think you were restoring the object to?
I mean, we can only speculate, but it seems like the verso is pretty much unfaded, but we can't confirm. And as we have shown, cross-checking with other originals, that there's a wide variety of tones and hues present with works on paper. So yeah, we can only achieve a reconstruction by making that our focus. The available data we gathered with our spectral photometric measurements and microfading testing.
Thank you. And just in follow-up to that question, we have one about how do you think this impacts the interpretation or the art historical understanding of the objects, kind of being able to restore them to a perhaps closer to a previous state virtually?
Well, I think it helps. Obviously, none of us are art historians or working as art historians, but I think it helps seeing something in a different context and not having to imagine how it maybe have looked before, but rather being able to see it and also compare it with other drawings. Yeah, for me, that helped. For me, it's looking at something slightly different in that way. But yeah, I guess it also depends on how good your imagination is.
Thank you. Our next question is for Tom, having to do with the FTIR work that you did on the Cassatt papers. Do you think that performing the FTIR at the fiber level kind of helped you understand how some fibers may have faded differently at different rates than others? This is something that we definitely see in the early modern variegated blue papers. We have blue fibers faded to different degrees, it becomes more visible under magnification. So just wondering, in the 19th century, if this work helped kind of inform that for you.
Yeah, I think we did see those types of changes. I mean, one thing I want to emphasize is we had the luxury of actually taking samples. We were very discreet in trying to be minimal about that, but being able to both pull samples out, pull fibers out, isolate fibers for FTIR and also for microscopy was really helpful for this project.
Thank you. And another one, Tom, this is for me, just for clarification. So the blue paper fragments that you were able to access on the backing board had two sort of shades of blue. You were looking at sort of the core of the paper and then the surface of the paper. Was that color difference due to just adhesive and mounting materials, or do you think there's actually two different shades of blue at play, one at the surface level and the core of the paper?
There was, the paper appeared to be very heavily sized and it was a protein, and it may be that was adhesive. There was adhesive applied to it subsequently, but we found very thick application of some protein in the core too. So it's speculating that we had gelatin there. I think that the paper, I think that the colors that we're seeing in the core are what we would have seen on the surface originally.
Makes sense. Those papers are crazy. Really kitchen sink papers. It looks like a lot going on. Next question is for Georg. Audience member asked, have you come across any written documentation about the artist's use of blue handmade paper versus the prepared blue paper? And any reason why he may have elected to use the prepared blue paper when there was blue paper accessible already from mills?
No, I think I tried to answer this question already in a written way. Unfortunately, we do not have any evidence, written evidence by Leoni himself. So we can just speculate. One thesis was that maybe the natural black chalk in the beginning of his career was from another quality, maybe harder, and he needed the preparation. And later on, the chalk could have been like softer, but we don't know this. This is just as a suggestion.
Great, thank you. Let's see, have a few more minutes. This is perhaps a question to everyone present on just artists' awareness of the fading of blue paper in general and how that may have impacted their work. Do any of you have any thoughts about that? Were the artists aware, your particular artists, that blue paper would fade and factor that into their practice?
I just want to mention that Cassatt is known for quoting that she very carefully looked at the pastels of Maurice Quentin de la Tour and found that his materials had faded, but she speculated that living in a modern era that and with new materials that hers would hold up better. I don't know if throughout her lifetime if she was aware of any of her materials fading, but I think she had the opinion that she was using things that were more stable.
Interesting. Anybody else, Georg?
Maybe for Leoni, I would say that I don't think he really thought a lot about this. I think it was about the effect, and we all know from pastel that the blue support makes you faster with creating the portrait. And I think many of the drawings were more like workshop material than artworks by themselves.
Okay, maybe just one more, also for you, Georg, about the sort of, maybe you mentioned this in your presentation, but didn't quite catch it. The drawings in your collection seem to have a very specific preservation of the blue on the right side of the sheet, at least in some instances, and more faded on the left. What do you attribute that to? Is that just a storage type of issue?
I think that this could be connected with the way Leoni had them arranged in his studio. And I always imagined that he had arranged them like overlapping. And that would be the reason why the very right part of some drawings was like covered and less damaged. And some have this better preserved parts at the lower edge. And I think one could guess that there was like part of the frame. But we don't know it exactly.
Thank you. Okay, well, that just about brings us to the end of the Q&A. We are now going to take a 15-minute break. And we ask everyone to rejoin us promptly at 10:30 for our next session. Thank everyone. I know you're joining me virtually in a round of applause for speakers in our first session. Thank you all so much.
Welcome back. I hope everyone had the chance to grab a snack. The second session of the day will be focusing on the use of blue paper in book publishing, printmaking, and print collecting. We have 3 speakers. Brett Sabenhill is the first one. Brett Sabenhill has held curatorial positions in Canada, Britain, and the US, notably as head of the Hebrew section of the British Library and as librarian and fellow in Hebrew bibliography at the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies. His exhibition, Karta Azura, Hebrew Printing on Blue Paper, was mounted in the King's Library within the British Museum in 1995, and his detailed survey of Hebrew printing on blue paper and other colored papers was published in 2011. Our second speaker is Armin Kunz, who's an art historian with a special interest in early modern works on paper and German Romanticism. Armin is also the owner of the prints and drawings dealership C.J. Berner. And finally, Rachel Happenu, who will be talking about an interesting new discovery. Rachel is the assistant curator of works on paper at the Courtauld Gallery in London, where she has worked since 2016. She has earned her MA and PhD from the Courtauld, specializing in medieval manuscript. And she's also the curator behind the current display at the Courtauld, Drawn to Blue, Artists' Use of Blue Paper. And with that, I would like to hand it over to Brett, who is experiencing some technical difficulties, so we won't be able to see him, and his slides will be shared by our AV technicians.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you again. There's a passage in the Talmud. Rabbi Meir asked, why is blue distinguished above all other colors? Because blue resembles the sky, and the sky resembles the divine throne, as it is written in the book of Exodus. And they saw the God of Israel. Under his feet there was the likeness of a pavement of sapphire, like the very sky for purity. Whatever that metaphorical or anthropomorphic language means, one gets the idea. Whether or not that Talmudic passage ever influenced the printers, it does seem that the color blue has had a particular association with Hebrew books. The use of blue paper over the course of nearly 4 centuries and in different corners of Europe has resulted in varieties of this paper possibly figuring more widely, longer, and more conspicuously in Hebrew book production than blue or any other color in the printing traditions of any single alphabet or language. I don't make that statement cavalierly. It's not to say that printers of Hebrew had any priority or monopoly in the use of this paper. They did not, nor that a particular colored paper is not associated with some other language or alphabet. A colleague of mine at the British Library drew my attention to the so-called Kitab Kuning, the books on yellow paper, which was used in the printing of 2 Southeast Asian languages in Arabic characters, Malay and Javanese, along with Arabic, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And by extension, the term came to be used for the whole traditional Islamic literature of the madrasa. But it is the case that in its broad geography and in 3 different periods, blue papers figured in some distinct way in the production and reception of Hebrew books, a phenomenon sometimes even noted by outside observers. The introduction of the secondary deluxe medium of blue paper, secondary after vellum by Aldo Manuzio, early in the 16th century, was almost immediately copied by another Christian printer publisher in Venice, Daniel Bomberg, a native of Antwerp, whose press serving a mainly Jewish market issued Hebrew books for over 30 years. Bomberg's employ of Karta Azura was in turn imitated by other mostly non-Jewish publishing houses in Venice, Bragadin, Grifo, Zanetti, Di Cara, and in other northern Italian towns, Cremona, Mantua, Padua, Sabioneta, Riva, who dominated Hebrew book printing in Italy for the rest of the century. This use of blue paper for deluxe copies of Hebrew books was probably unnecessarily little known in its own time. After all, these deluxe copies were seen by few people, and inasmuch as these copies were then scattered and preserved together in no single repository, the full dimensions of the practice are only now appreciable, thanks on the one hand to recent bibliographic work, and on the other to the antiquarian trade, which has drawn new attention to it. To mention only the most sensational example, the second highest price ever paid for a Hebrew book, and at the time it was the highest price, was for the unique, known, albeit incomplete, set of Bomberg's multi-volume edition of the Babylonian Talmud, printed on blue paper in Venice, starting in 1521, auctioned at Sotheby's in 2008. And I learned that just this past week, a unique blue paper exemplar, otherwise unknown, the book was known, but the exemplar in blue paper was unknown, of a Hebrew liturgy printed in Mantua in 1556, which was sold at auction. The use of blue paper by Bomberg in the early 16th century was the subject of a paper I read at the conference on blue paper arranged by Alexa McCarthy at the University of St. Andrews 3 years ago. Today, I wish to turn to the later manifestations of this phenomenon, and if you be so kind, panel 2. If the historians of Hebrew printing knew relatively little until recently of the number of blue paper copies from 16th century Italy, they had a slightly better idea of the second period of deluxe printing on colored paper, especially blue, from the mid-17th century through the mid-18th, an age of Hebrew bibliophilic revival in Western and Central Europe. Among the few books printed on blue paper in any language in the 17th century are those in Hebrew from Amsterdam, where even before 1700, Jewish printers experimented and introduced a further embellishment, text entirely in red ink on blue paper. Not partially in red ink, but entirely in red ink on blue paper. The vogue for this deluxe medium was most pronounced in Amsterdam. Here, the printer Props produced copies of both the largest and the tiniest of Hebrew volumes, as well as several Yiddish books on blue paper. The practice extended in this period to the German towns Frankfurt, Wandsbek, Frankfurt an der Oder, that's the other Frankfurt, and Berlin, all of them Hebrew printing centers. According to a contemporary Christian Hebraist who was aware of this presumed Jewish predilection, books printed on blue paper were considered good for the eyes. But this is probably no more than an excuse for a bourgeois extravagance, as anyone who has tried to read them knows full well. The 19th century bibliographer Steinschneider, in his prolix catalogue of the Bodleian Library's Hebrew printed books, noted deluxe copies on blue paper, Carta Carulea, as well as on other colored papers, on vellum, and on large wide margin paper, Carta Magna. Almost all of these deluxe copies had been assembled in the decades before and after 1700 by the famous bibliophile David Oppenheim, chief rabbi of Bohemia, whose library was acquired en bloc by Oxford in 1829. Oppenheim had himself commissioned no fewer than 46 deluxe copies on colored papers, 36 of them on blue. That's nearly the number of individual Hebrew titles on blue that are recorded for the entire 16th century in Italy. Most notable among the deluxe copies of this period are the unique complete sets of 2 Talmud editions, one issued in Berlin and Frankfurt an der Oder between 1715 and 1721, 24 volumes on large blue paper, Carta Caerulea Maxima, commissioned by Oppenheim, and the other, an edition of the Talmud issued in Amsterdam in 1721, commissioned by Oppenheim's relation, Viennese court Jew Wertheimer, sets which are now preserved in Oxford and New York, respectively. Today, libraries in Oxford, New York, and Jerusalem hold the largest collections of Hebrew printing on blue paper. It's, of course, the deluxe printing of 16th century Italy and that of Western and Central Europe before and after 1700 that are most familiar to specialists in blue paper. Yet it's not these two periods and climes whose blue paper books were or have been best known to readers of pre-modern Hebraica and to students of Jewish book lore. Rather, it's the tinted papers used for less aesthetic reasons in the late 18th and early 19th centuries in Eastern Europe, especially in historic Ukrainian territory, a region with the largest array of Hebrew printing towns in the world to that date, which resulted in blue figuring so significantly in Jewish book history. Panel 3, please. This separate phenomenon, which began in the 1780s and carried on for decades, was completely unrelated to the prior deluxe use of blue paper, although it's often confused with it. At dozens of printing houses throughout the Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, and Lithuania, the use of tinted paper became the norm. The particular tint, often characterized is often characterized in the bibliographic and antiquarian literature not as blue, but as bluish, which is effectively, if imprecisely, a terminus technicus for the hue, or actually a range of hues on the color spectrum. A bibliographer friend of mine once printed out for me a complete list of all the blue paper books recorded in the comprehensive online bibliography of Hebrew printing compiled at the National Library of Israel in Jerusalem. It was a thick volume that he kindly prepared for me. For a long time, I couldn't understand why so few of the books from Eastern Europe actually figured in these records, until I realized that the keyword he had used in the digital search of the database was blue, kachol, and not bluish, kachalchal. The compendium would have been larger by an order of magnitude had it incorporated the books whose paper was regularly denoted by catalogers as bluish and not as blue. These tinted papers, indeed bluish, but quite unevenly so, were regularly employed by indigent Hebrew printers in such towns as Koretz, Poritsk, Dubno, Mezherich, Sudilkiv, Bilazirka, and especially Slavuta and Ostrich in Volhynia, Moiliv, Medjugorje, and Yanov in Podolia, farther east at Berdychev near Kiev, Zbaraj and Ternopil in Galicia, at Yusufov in Poland, at Kopis, Rodna, Minsk, and Shklov in Belarus, and at Vilna, now Vilnius in Lithuania. Now, some of these towns are large urban centers, and some of you may recognize one or two of the place names. But many of them are no more than hamlets, some virtually unfindable on the map, whose Hebrew press, which may have been the most significant industry in their history, established their name in the annals of printing and of the Hebrew book. As you can see in these illustrations, the place of printing was often the most prominent word on the title page, the printers obviously vaunting their achievement and immortalizing their town in typographic history. In contrast to Hebrew printing in earlier centuries, most Hebrew books printed in Eastern Europe in the decades before and after 1800 were on this inferior bluish paper, and copies on good white paper were the exception. As several printing historians have pointed out, paper was the single largest ongoing expense in book production, more than the one-time outlay for the press and the type, and more onerous than engaging wandering Talmud students as typesetters at minimal cost. Poor quality paper made from colored rags was more accessible to the printers in these towns. And I have to beg the forgiveness of one of the colleagues presenting at the conference yesterday, who said that that statement is not necessarily correct. And I would be very grateful for some communication afterwards to clarify it. I always understood that the cheap tinted paper was indeed cheap, and good white paper was indeed expensive. According to a Russian paper historian whom I consulted at Oxford, bluish paper was common in Russian printing at this time, and especially in books of the dissident Russian Old Believers, possibly for similar reasons of economy. That this paper was in particular used by the Jewish printing offices was remarked by an outside observer, a Scottish missionary with the British and Foreign Bible Society, who traveled in the Tsarist lands in the second decade of the 19th century. Jews are said to have been involved in paper making in this region, though I have no information on any mills connected with them. Jews were certainly engaged in paper making in neighboring Upper Hungary, today Slovakia, in the 19th century. Panel 4, please. The products of the East European Hebrew presses were often less than optimum in their typography and layout, and whether the printers were indifferent to paper quality or simply not in the financial position to improve it, the paper stock used in their books was wildly disparate in tint. The uneven coloring of some bluish papers at times appears green or greenish, and these hues are often found mixed together indiscriminately in a single book. This combination of variously tinted papers was so common that one writer later in the century stated outright that the Jews in this region liked their books to be printed on a variety of colored papers. Back to panel 3, please. A few printers did display an appreciation for the aesthetic possibilities of blue paper and tried to make use of uniformly tinted stock for individual copies or even for entire runs. For example, a few books printed at Sudilkiv in Volhynia around 1835. This was just before the closing of the Hebrew presses by Tsarist decree, stand out from other East European editions in the bright pastel hue of their paper. You see that in the middle of the bottom line. The selective use of red ink on the title pages of some of these editions is a further indication of an aesthetic sensibility, even when typography was at a lower ebb. This is also apparent when blue paper of whatever tint comes together with more refined typesetting or attractive ornamental devices. At times, it's virtually impossible to distinguish between the economical use of cheap bluish paper and the intentional use of blue paper for aesthetic reasons. And it's likely that in more than a few instances, the two motives coalesced in the production of a book. Some books printed at Dubrovno and Rodna in Belarusia, at Mezhirov in Podolia, at Bohuslav in eastern Ukraine, as well as at Slavuta and Vilna, where typography was more refined, are ostensibly in this category, that is, tinted paper with some other visual enhancement. Regardless of any aesthetic considerations, tinted papers were utilized in a number of towns well into the 19th century. Very lightly tinted paper was still used in the 1830s and 1840s at Lemberg and Zhokiev in Austria and Galicia, in the 1840s at Jassy in Moldavia, in the 1850s at Warsaw and at Czernowitz in Bukovina, and in the 1860s at Stettin in East Prussia, now in Poland. I mention these places and dates only to show how this earlier phenomenon had something of a sporadic afterlife before finally tapering off. The recollection of blue paper texts remained vivid among traditionally educated Jews raised in this part of Europe. Today, the tinted paper of the East European editions is recognized as in no way comparable to the blue paper of rare deluxe copies of earlier centuries. But as I discovered in the course of my research, and this was rather startling, no fewer than 5 of the greatest modern Hebrew and Yiddish writers, Mendele, Bialik, Agnon, Bashevis, Singer, and Sutzkever, 2 of them Nobel Prize winners at that, all of them natives of this region, make reference somewhere in their work, whether prose or poetry or memoir, to Hebrew books on blue paper. These writers didn't have in mind the deluxe copies printed in Italy in the 16th century, nor even the more recent blue paper books from 17th and 18th century Amsterdam and Central Europe. Rather, they were referring to the books commonly printed on poor quality blue or bluish paper in Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Lithuanian territory before and after 1800, books such as were found in traditional study houses and on their fathers' or grandfathers' shelves. These literary references indicate that it was a widespread notion among East European Jews of the late 19th century and well into the 20th, on the basis of what they themselves had seen, that old Hebrew books were on blue paper. Almost uncannily, the various mentions of blue paper books by these writers managed to capture the subject in all of its particularities, each in a different way. As I've written about this elsewhere, I'll only cite 2 of these now. The Volhynian-born Hebrew poet Bialik, born in 1873, wrote that the books on bluish paper had a great influence on the mind and imagination of generations of Talmud students. He also drew attention to the particular geography of their imprints, the memory of which was already receding in his day. When in 1935, the Polish-Yiddish novelist Bashevis Singer, born in 1903, a generation after Bialik, described the sky in a time of messianic fervor as blue as the leaves of old Hebrew books, blau wie die Blätter von alten Sfurim. His readers would have understood the simile in a way his later translators have not. The use of blue or bluish paper in Eastern Europe, along with general confusion surrounding the significance of this paper, led to its being called out in booksellers' catalogs and even prized. at least one major library preserved in its rare book department some of these later blue paper copies, together with real deluxe printing from previous centuries. Not all librarians, antiquarians, and collectors have been cognizant of the distinction between the deluxe copies of prior centuries in Italy, Holland, and the German lands, and the later common employ of low-quality paper in Eastern Europe, nor for that matter is the distinction always patent. However one spins it, the products of this third period of Hebrew printing on blue paper are not without interest. The very fact that between 1790 and 1836, a large portion of East European Hebrew books was printed on bluish paper, or bluish papers, led to a popular identification of this mainly rabbinic literature with this color. One distinguished bibliophile in Jerusalem, a professor of book history, privately assembled a whole collection of these books, which eventually passed to university libraries about 35 years ago, just before I came on the scene. One of his students in the library school at the Hebrew University wrote a forensic study on the composition of the paper used in these books. I remember very distinctly that the professor's collection was not referred to in conversation as printing from Eastern Europe. That's why I remember this, but rather as books on blue paper. So this metonymy, calling the whole corpus of literature by the color of the paper, was almost exactly parallel to the usage of the term kitab kuning, yellow paper books, for its Arabic character Islamic literature in Indonesia, though in the case of the Hebrew, it was only an informal usage, and in the case of Malay and Javanese, it became a formal category of literary history. Whatever the intention or perception may have been, the use of blue paper in Hebrew printing in varying circumstances extended with interruptions over the course of 350 years from 16th century Italy through Holland and Central Europe from the mid-17th through the mid-18th centuries, and finally to Eastern Europe just before and well after 1800, to which I've drawn attention today. The bijou example of Hebrew books on blue paper from the Ottoman lands, North Africa, and India, of which there are very few, as well as the unrelated lightly tinted bluish paper is used in some printing in 19th century Italy, France, the German lands, and Scandinavia, a practice which is more related to co-territorial non-Jewish printing. Not to mention the green or greenish paper with which the blue papers are often conflated and whose figures somewhere on a broad spectrum will have to be taken up on another day. Thank you for your attention, and now I would like to yield the screen to Armin Kunz, a director of the Brenner Gallery in New York, who will speak about blueprints. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Let's see. Well, okay. Brad, that was fantastic. That's a tough act to follow. Okay, I'll try. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to participate in this colloquium. Perhaps I should best start by pointing out all the things this paper will not be able to do. I will not give any scientific analysis of the work that I'm showing, and I will also not be able to provide conclusive answers to the questions it raises. What I would like to do, however, is to invite a closer look at the visual evidence. For the most part, I'm going to show works from two collections, not exclusively, but it's mostly from the comprehensive holdings of Dutch Mannerist prints at the Art Institute of Chicago that can now be counted among the most important of its kind outside of the Netherlands, thanks to the acquisition last year of the private collection of New York collector Charlie Hack. And the other collection is the rather incomparable collection of French and Italian Mannerist prints put together over many decades by the German artist Georg Baselitz. Here, I would also like to thank his son, Daniel Blau, who invited me to work with this material and who pointed out some of the evidence I'm going to present to you later in the talk. In a certain way, what follows is an investigation into artistic intentionality. Stripped from that somewhat academic jargon, the question I'm posing is quite simple. Were the prints that I'm going to show in this brief survey meant by the original makers to look the way they do? Let's start with this landscape etching by Augustin Hirschvogel, a Nuremberg mathematician, cartographer, printmaker, who also worked in Ljubljana and spent the last decade of his life in Vienna. It was there that he made, in the brief time span of about 4 years between 1545 and 1549, the 35 landscape etchings that secured him a place in the circle of Bavarian and Austrian artists now referred to as the Danube School. The present one is a prominent example. Dated 1545 in the plate, it is generally believed to be one, if not the earliest Northern European print printed on blue paper. But what does it mean? Printed on blue paper by the artist at the time of its creation, or printed on blue paper by a later owner of the plate? This is the core question in the following survey. Moving further north and 4 decades on, my next example is Henrik Goltzius's woodcut portrait of Gilles van Breen, an engraver, painter, and printer active in Haarlem at the end of the 16th century. It is seen here in 3 impressions. The one on blue paper also serves as the basis of the identification of the sitter as Van Breen, since it reads below in pen and ink, Gilles van Breen, Kunstdrucker van Haar Holtzius. The deterioration of the blind block in the chiaroscuro version of this print is quite obvious and has also been remarked upon in the literature. First, Walter Strauss suggested that Goltzius might not have been responsible for the publication of the chiaroscuro edition of the woodcut. The apparently pristine condition of the tone blocks led Nancy Biella to suggest that they were probably made by another hand. And as we can see on the right, oh no, that is actually the slide. Then the next one is, let's see, yeah, okay. The most famous examples of such a later reuse of 2 woodcuts by are the 2 woodcuts by Albrecht Dürer that were conceived as line blocks. His Rhinoceros of 1515, here seen on the right, and the portrait of Ulrich Warnbühler of 1522. Dürer himself never made chiaroscuro prints, but both prints do exist in this form. Both blocks made their way to Amsterdam into the possession of the printer and publisher Willem Janssen. Janssen then commissioned tone blocks to reissue both prints sometime around 1620. To note, this is over a century after both prints were made by Dürer. Willem Janssen also reissued many of Goltzius's other chiaroscuro woodcuts from the late 1580s, most importantly, here on the left, his Hercules and Cacus from 1588, which does indeed exist with Janssen's address in letterpress below the image, which we can see in the impression here from the National Gallery of Scotland, as well as his 7 oval deities, which originally date from the 1588 to 1590. Here, an example of one of the 7, the image of Helios or Day or Eris, sometimes called, in a later impression that was printed by Janssen, again in circa 1620. Now let's come back to the Van Breen portrait, and here especially to the impression on blue paper on the left. 4 examples of that state unknown. They are indeed the earliest impressions, and they are hence described by the New Holstein as first state. Looking closely, however, and I did a few scribbles here, it becomes obvious that the line block, even in those early impressions, already shows signs of deterioration, most notably some wormholes in the lower right corner. I therefore hesitate to accept that it was printed, and even less so enhanced with white heightening, by the artist himself. Interesting to note is further, and you can see this here on the right, that the publisher who commissioned the line block also ventured into to print the now extremely deteriorated line block. I mean, the publisher who commissioned the tone blocks now also actually made impressions of the very badly deteriorated line block on blue paper. Examples of such a late use of the blocks are also the 2 impressions of the repentant Magdalene shown here. Impressions of this small woodcut are rare, so it should therefore perhaps not be much of a surprise that no impressions seem to have survived with the wood block still intact. This does, by the way, also raise the question about the significance of Goltzius's monogram that is cut in the upper right corner of the darker tone block, which you can see on the right. But the tone block, in all likelihood commissioned by the later, most likely posthumous publisher of the print, the monogram has to be seen less as a statement of the artist's authorship and instead as a marker added by the printer publisher to posthumously denote Goltzius's authorship and therefore increase desirability and hence saleability of the work. Impressions of blue paper are also known for the 4 small woodcuts depicting landscapes that are usually dated between 1597 and 1600. And I'm showing you 2 examples here. The landscape with the waterfall, I think it is quite obvious, just looking at the borderlines, the cracks in the borderline, that the chiaroscuro impression once again is much later. However, the impressions on blue paper and white paper seem to be fairly congruent, looking just at the state of the block. Here are a few details. One can see in the white, but even on the white paper impression, that below the fisherman who stands by the watercolor, by the waterfall, there is already a wormhole. Then there seems to a long, langish, warm channel running up from the fishing route of the angler. And then also I want to point out just how poorly, or rather blotchy, the birds start to print in the later impression, and that below the angler, what is 1 wormhole in the first impressions is now 2 in the second. Another example is this landscape from the set of 4. We have a similar evidence here. We have white and blue paper impressions that seem to be fairly contemporary, or rather simultaneously printed, whereas the chiaroscuro impression is significantly later. One small detail I want to point out, one might notice that there is a big bird in the sky. One wonders what happens to that, because we don't have it in all the other impressions. Turns out on closer inspection that the impression here at the Rijksprentencabinet in Amsterdam, that this is actually added in pen and ink. So that was a later embellishment, and that other impressions on blue paper, like the one in Stuttgart, actually don't show any of that. In the case of Goltzius woodcuts, questions of when each of these impressions was printed entered the connoissorial discourse only relatively late, whereas compendia addressing the relative printing chronology were early on part of the scholarship of such printmakers as Dürer and Rembrandt. Monograms were taken at face value, and the lure of the blue paper, especially when combined with white highlights applied by hand, quickly led to the conclusion that only the designing artist himself could have been the author. Early catalogers such as Winslow Ames and Walter Strauss even went as far as seeing those retouched impressions as working proofs for the chiaroscuro prints. Nancy Biala's groundbreaking research convincingly refuted such a notion, by the way, that was much beloved by the art market. Biala not only pointed out that too many of those touched-up impressions survived to qualify them as a one-off model, and she also remarked on the lack of parallels between the white highlights on blue paper impressions and those of the chiaroscuro prints. If the landscape woodcuts suggest that the impressions of white paper are made at the same time as those on blue paper, and both those always predate the impression on chiaroscuro, the sequence of 3 impressions of the young man with fluttering drapery made around the same time as the landscapes in circa 1598 presents a slightly different picture. Judging from the sharpness of the printed lines on the blue paper impression, these might have most likely been printed first, whereas the thick lines and blotched up areas that were originally areas of finely hatched lines suggest that in this instance, the impression on white paper came last. As you can see, there are plenty of open questions surrounding this body of work, but at least one might say that, that since the woodcuts of Gillis van Brain and the Repentant Magdalene date from the second half of the 1580s, and the small and therefore are about 10 to 15 years earlier than the small landscape, that could maybe explain the deterioration of the line block compared to these slightly later works. Based on the evidence of the watermarks found in the white papers, Willem Janssen's printing, or better reprinting campaign of Goltzius's chiaroscuro prints did not happen until circa 1620 and probably even later. Goltzius died in 1617, and his involvement with printmaking had already stopped around 1600. I therefore very much doubt that the reissue of these printing matrices, combined with imaginative color combinations as well as the use of blue paper, did happen in his studio. Goltzius' own blue paper drawings, like the ones shown yesterday by Judith Norman, did indeed provide models for the introduction of color of these prints, models, however, in a more general aesthetic way and hardly in the way earlier catalogers saw them as working proofs in preparation for chiaroscuro woodcuts. With the exception of the Hercules and Cacus and the oval deities, the examples shown here were in all likelihood products of printers, publishers who tried to maximize the appeal of the already compromised matrices and therefore to increase their marketability. With this in mind, I would like to return to the National Gallery's treasured Hirschvogel etching and look at it somewhat closer. As far as I understand, blue papers, especially those of lesser quality and intent for non-artistic purposes, are rare, which limits, watermarks are rare in these papers, which limits our capability to use them for dating. The examples shown here show, however, that the date of the printing matrix, be it Hirschvogel's etching blade or Goltzius's woodblocks, does not necessarily coincide with the date of the specific impressions. And I now want to show you three little details. To the left is the white paper impression of the Hirschvogel, also at the National Gallery. And you can see in some of the lines of the tree how the lines break up. The cause here is that there is old ink, previous printer's ink that has dried up, doesn't clean up, and therefore the etched lines no longer catch the printer's ink sufficiently. The same you can see here even more in these kind of areas of tree, of the leaves for the tree, and then once more here. What we can see here also is in the blank areas towards the left that there are very fine wiping scratches, also things that denote a very early impression. And these are actually tiny little details and nuances that have long since gone from the impression on blue paper. The existence of mid-century Therefore, the existence of a mid-16th century German etching on blue paper does not prove the use of this paper by the artist who created it. Recognizing the signs of deterioration of the plate, it could also be the case that Hirschvogel's plate has been given what a Gen Z person would call a glow-up, thereby using an aesthetic sensibility that was more in sync with the time of the printing than with the time of the print's creation. Other similar examples of this phenomenon are known. What comes to mind here are impressions of Dürer engravings on silk. We have already seen that Dürer had never made chiaroscuro woodcuts and that those that exist were printed a century later. The same is true for impressions of his largest engraving, the masterful St. Eustace of 1501, that are printed on silk. Two of them survive. I'm showing here the print and the detail of it that shows the structure of the fine silk in the Städel in Frankfurt. In a different way, however, in a different way, whoever printed them was clearly aware of the Dutch custom to print representative portraits of rulers on precious silk with the intent that those could be then given as gifts to other dignitaries, as seen here in Willem Delft's portraits of the princes of Orange-Nassau. Their appearance in these photos with somewhat ropey margins is misleading. They are large prints measuring 18 by 13 inches or 45 by 35 centimeters, and the images themselves survive in remarkably good condition and have to be considered as of utmost rarity in such a state of preservation. The printers of Dürer St. Eustace, an equally large print, did undoubtedly allude to such models. As we have heard already from the scholars and paper conservators working on Italian drawings yesterday and today, Italy was clearly an early center of the use of blue papers for artistic purposes. It was here, as we all know, that Dürer first encountered Carta Azzurra and then eagerly used it to draw recordos of details from his Feast of the Rose Garland altarpiece that he executed in Venice in 1506. To conclude, I would therefore like make a brief excursion south into the homeland of blue paper and show you 3 examples of prints on colored paper, not just blue, but you will see why these variations, just to make my point. The first is that an anonymous etcher based on a composition by Parmigianino. The three works that I'm showing now, they are all from the Baswitz collection. And I want to point out what, again, I've circled here is these kind of blue flood lines that one can see on the verso of the sheet when it's lifted. All 3 prints are today, all these prints that I'm showing, these 3, come from an album that was owned by the Earls of Spencer and had been put together sometime after 1733. So I'm showing you this here. The other example is also apparently, it looks like on the recto, a blue paper impression of one of Francesco Parmigianino's entombments. You see on the back that this is also prepared paper. It is therefore not Carta Azzurra. And I think then the most telling example, although not blue, is the other Parmigianino entombment, the other version of it, where looking on the back, we can see a lot of both flood lines along the edges and blotches of the yellow paint that was used to color the print at the front. The backs of many of these over 100 prints in this album many of them show the signature of the French dealer Jean Mariette, often with the dates from the 1720s. What the backs of many of the prints also showed is that the prints on blue paper, and this one here on yellow paper, were not printed on Carta Azzurra or thoroughly kind of colored yellow paper. This is true for the anonymous lesson of needlework, which was the first thing that I showed you, and as well as for this Parmigianino. The most telling example is the last one. Yellow instead of blue, the pooling of the color runs neatly along the edges, and those edges are in no way the edges of the sheet when it came off the press, but are the result of the usual trimming that happens in the course of a print's life while it changes hands, gets stuck in albums, and is removed again. What the evidence of these color sheets suggests is that in all likelihood, the watercolor set was neither in Parmigianino's studio nor in the shop of whoever printed this very impression. It is far more likely that here it was the Paris dealership that performed the glow-up, once more clearly influenced by an aesthetic that might have very well been derived from the drawings, but hardly part of the artistic intent of the person who had etched the play 600 miles away and 200 years earlier. Thank you. And now I would like to introduce the last speaker of this session, which is Rachel from the Courtauld. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Armin. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak. And thank you to everyone listening for making it to the end of this fascinating and exhaustive 2-day symposium. We've heard about some sweeping surveys of blue paper and important interrogations of the social and political history of blue paper over the last 2 days. But I'm going to finish the talks by focusing quite narrowly on 5 volumes of prints in the collection of the Courtauld, which had never been cataloged and were therefore overlooked until a few months ago, when I was preparing Drawn to Blue, Artists' Use of Blue Paper, which I have to plug, now on display at the Courtauld until the 26th of January, and which stems from a collaboration with the Getty. So we're very grateful to them. By chance at this time, a Fragonard expert, Marie-Anne Dupuy-Vachy, happened to visit our print room. She was intrigued by the entry on our website of these 5 albums, cataloged only as prints after Fragonard, as you can see here, as per their title pages. And it was she who remarked offhandedly after seeing them in person that these were interesting blue paper specimens. So we're grateful to her for bringing them to our attention. And here you can see nearly all cataloging information is absent, hence our ignorance that these albums contained any works on blue paper. Before delving deeper into the albums, I have to set the stage with some context on their authorship. All 5 albums contain prints which are by Jean-Claude Richard, the Abbé de Sénon. Born in 1727, he was urged by his family to follow a religious path and was appointed by the king as an abbé commendataire, that is, one of 700 secular members of the clergy who received an income with no actual service required. His abbey afforded him a modest income per year, but this was supplemented by his wealthy father. In 1763, his father received the seigneuries of Bretèche and Saint-Non, which he split between his 2 sons, hence the moniker of Saint-Non, by which our protagonist has always been known. He lived his life as an amateur artist and undertook several European tours, the most important of which was in 1759, when he arrived in Rome. He stayed in Italy for approximately 2 years, where he made the acquaintance of several artists, whom he then employed to make drawings on his behalf. Drawings of Renaissance, Baroque, and 18th century works of art, as well as antiquities, villas, and general landscapes. One of these artists was Hubert Robert, but the principal artist was Jean-Honoré Fragonard, and their friendship lasted until the end of Saint-Non's life. Indeed, Fragonard was the artist of this portrait now in the Louvre of Saint-Non. Together, from the summer of 1760, Saint-Non and Fragonard traveled to Tivoli, Naples, Florence, Bologna, Venice, and Genoa before returning to Paris together in September 1761. Fragonard produced around 400 sketches from this fruitful period of traveling, which stayed in his patron Saint-Non's possession. These were sketches after paintings by all of the great Italian masters, and sometimes he copied an entire composition. So here I'm showing you his drawing after a fresco in Naples by Francesco Solimena, but you can see that he has taken some liberties and made some adjustments to the composition here. And sometimes he would pick out individual heads, figures, or scenes and might combine them with unrelated sketches all on the same sheet. So here's a drawing which selects just 2 figure groups from the Sistine Chapel. Most of these drawings were executed in black chalk, some in red. These drawings were annotated by Saint-Non with the names of the artists to whom they were attributed and a short description of the location of the work. There are also counterproofs of most of these drawings, presumably so that both Fragonard and Saint-Non could have a record of these works. These counterproofs are usually reworked in black chalk and inscriptions added on in pen by Saint-Non. Today, these drawings and counterproofs are widely dispersed, with the Norton Simon Museum in California and the British Museum having the largest collections. And here is a smattering of the 139 examples at the Norton Simon Museum. Saint-Non was clearly enamored with these sketches by Fragonard, writing to his brother that there is magic in them. And beginning in 1770, he began publishing prints of these drawings in a series titled Fragments Chosen from Among the Most Interesting Churches and Palaces in Italy. From here, I shall just refer to this work as the Fragments. Ultimately, there were 6 volumes of the Fragments called Suites, published periodically from 1770 to 1775, with 2 volumes dedicated to Rome, the others to Naples, Bologna, Venice, and Herculaneum. That brings us to the first 4 albums in the Courtaulds collection, which contain the Fragments. There is only 1 volume on Rome, so 1 is missing, and the Herculaneum prints have been incorporated into the Naples album. But before I can delve even deeper, I have to explain how these prints were made. They are etchings, but crucially, Saint-Non was one of the earliest practitioners of the newly reinvented technique of aquatint. Aquatint is a printmaking process that can produce tone in the printing plate, which enabled printmakers for the first time to effectively reproduce wash and watercolor drawings. There are a variety of techniques, but the basic process is to distribute pulverized or powdered grain, typically resin, across a copper plate and fuse it to the plate with heat. You then submerge the plate in an acid bath, where the acid bites the exposed areas of copper around and between the particles. The resulting speckled pattern is read by the human eye as tone, The final appearance varies based on the size of the particles, how they have been applied, and how long or how often the plate has been submerged in acid. And here I'm showing you a plate I prepared with aquatint and the resulting print. And here is a close-up detail of the speckled appearance of the plate. I say this process was newly reinvented because it was first utilized by Jan van de Velde IV in the Netherlands in the 1650s, but at the time there was little commercial incentive for these kinds of prints, and so aquatint fell out of use until the second half of the 18th century. In the 1760s in France, a number of French artists took up the process once more, and it seems likely that our Abbé de Sénon was taught the technique from an artist named François-Philippe Charpentier, who developed his version of aquatint apparently for the reissued edition of the Recueil-Crozat, which reproduced the collection of drawings owned by the famed connoisseur Pierre Crozat. The first edition of the Recueil-Crozat, a page which I am showing on the left, used etching and colored wood blocks to imitate the effects of wash, but for the new revised edition some 20 years later, as shown on the right, Charpentier developed this new technique of aquatint. Charpentier sought out wealthy amateurs like Saint-Nont who could fund his endeavors, to whom he would teach the technique in return. Saint-Nont had already been an active etcher for 10 years and owned his own tabletop press. His first aquatint dates from around 1765, and aquatint quickly became his preferred method as he produced around 300 in total for his various publications. It was the perfect moment for him to discover this process that could help him transform the hundreds of drawings produced for him by artists like Fragonard into reasonable reproductions for his publications. So we can return to the first 4 Courtauld albums of the fragments. They are quarto size, all bound in full calf, with decorative gold tooling on boards with marbled end papers, which were all rebacked with leather at some point in their past. The first 3 volumes, that is of Rome, Bologna, and Naples, all contain prints on blue paper, as seen here. These are etchings combined with aquatint printed on blue paper. In addition, white opaque watercolor has been manually added to these prints. Puzzlingly, the 4th album on Venice contains only prints on white paper, as seen here. Interestingly, the pages of the 1st album on Rome also have stubs inserted in blue paper, which I'm showing here. This is on the outer fold of each folio. A strip of blue paper was added, the purpose being to elongate each sheet so that the stubs and not the paper are folded into the spine. The full margins of the paper are thus retained, providing a centered and symmetric presentation for each print. The fragments have been fairly well studied, but I have only found one mention of this series ever being printed on blue paper, which is in a 1928 publication by Louis Guimbaud of archival documents by Saint-Nont. Guimbaud described 3 states of the fragments, the first in bistre on white paper, the second in black ink on blue shaded paper, the third in black ink on white paper. For this second state, he uses the words papier bleuté rather than papier bleu, so much like in Brad's talk earlier, bluish rather than blue. Again, I have to thank Marie-Anne Dupuy-Vachy, who identified a likely sale at which these albums may have appeared. The Pigache sale on 21st of October 1776, and note that's only 1 year after the final suite was published. This was likely Philibert Pierre Nicolas Pigache, a collector and dealer. In the catalogue, it describes 2 albums on Rome and 1 on Bologna on blue paper, with no mention of Venice, and so it seems likely that our set was missing the Venice suite from the beginning. The lot describes the 2 albums on Rome comprising 60 total illustrations, and our single volume on Rome has that number. It describes 40 illustrations in the Bolognese album, and ours has 39, but the final print seems to be missing as there is an empty frame for it. I have not yet found another example anywhere of this set of this publication on blue paper. To my knowledge, there are only a few isolated sheets in the British Museum, Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, the Fogg Art Museum, and the Rijksmuseum. In terms of the additional white highlights added on top of these prints, when comparing a blue print version on the right to an impression on white paper on the left, it's clear the artist was trying to compensate for the white highlights provided by the white paper, now missing in the blue versions, and thus missing the sense of 3-dimensionality provided by the representation of light. This also supports Guimbaud's statement that the blue paper state was secondary to the white paper version, as Saint-Nont seems to have been comparing the 2 states and adding the white highlights accordingly. It therefore seems like Saint-Nont was experimenting with the effects of this new printmaking technique of aquatint and its visual effect on blue paper, which he perhaps found lacking, explaining the scarcity of other blue paper copies of this series. With the rest of the short time I have left, I want to discuss the fifth album at the Courtauld. This concerns a later publication by Saint-Nont, the Recueil de Griffonnies, de Vues, Paysages, Fragments Antiques et Sujets Historiques, known from here on as the Griffonnies. Here is the cover of our copy, and on the right is how it currently looks on display at the Courtauld. This is a bespoke size landscape format bound in full calf with decorative gold tooling and marbled end papers, but different in design to the binding on the other 4 volumes of the fragments. There are a number of different states of the Griffonnies, with the first appearing possibly around 1778 to 1780, and others dating into the early 19th century. This compendium of sketches reused earlier plates from the fragments, as well as some prints after drawings by other artists such as Jean-Baptiste Leprince and Hubert Robert and Jean-Robert Angot. The most complete known version of the Griffonnies comprised 296 plates. Our album contains 60 pages, each page containing between 1 and 5 plates, all of which have been trimmed, some significantly so, for a total of 123 plates, so a significant shortfall from a full set. However, the first unique aspect of our set is the title page. And you will, of course, recall that I said the title of this publication was the Recueil de Griffonnies, de Vues, Paysages, Fragments Antiques et Sujets Historiques. But you can see in our frontispiece here that the words Fragments Antiques do not actually appear. When compared to the frontispiece from other copies of the publication, such as this one in the Getty, you can see that only the second and third lines of the title have been amended on the plate to squeeze in those extra 2 words. There are 3 known states of this frontispiece, including one before letters, but I think ours may be an as yet undescribed second state before the title was finalized. Of the other plates contained in this album, 14 are on blue paper, 21 are on blued paper, the rest on traditionally white paper. So here on the right, I am showing you folio 11 from the album with prints on blue paper, and on the left, folio 1 has a print on white paper at center, and surrounding it are 4 smaller prints on blued paper. Blued paper with a D, which I also briefly referenced earlier, is a result of adding blue pigment into a vat of unbleached white paper pulp as a means of counteracting the natural yellow tone of these cellulose fibers. This technique was less expensive than bleaching the pulp and was a common practice in 18th century papermaking, with smalt being a typical blue pigment used. I analyzed the paper of one of these blued prints using reflectance spectroscopy on our video spectral comparator. Here I am using the VSC in the background at left. This scanner also made a cameo in Elizabeth's talk yesterday and was mentioned in Tom's talk earlier today. Reflectance spectroscopy measures how much light is absorbed and reflected by colors within the visible and infrared spectrum, and we saw this demonstrated as well yesterday in Charlotte's presentation and York's talk earlier today as well. I am grateful to Michelle from the Getty for guiding me how to use this tool. First, Michelle supplied me with a sample she prepared of known blue pigments, which I scanned to produce a reference library against which I could then compare any new readings I took from the paper of works in our collection. So here's a photograph of the sample Michelle kindly supplied us with. And here are the results, the varying peaks and valleys of some of the blue pigments as charted on this graph, ranging from 400 nanometers at the left in the visible spectrum up to 1000 nanometers on the right in the infrared spectrum. You have numerous natural blue pigments represented here: smalt, logwood, azurite, ultramarine, and indigo tin, which is the blue compound found in both wood and indigo plants, as well as synthetic Prussian blue in the purple at the bottom. So back on folio 1, I looked more closely at this print in the upper left and then magnified this area here. And this shows you what the paper looks like under magnification. Hopefully it's apparent, though somewhat fuzzy, that there are blue particles distributed throughout this paper structure, which I then sampled by focusing in the crosshairs there and averaged them to get a resulting wavelength, which you can see here on your screen, but it's somewhat inconclusive as the particles are so small and there's quite a lot of interference from the white fibers around. So when Michelle was here in our studio, she was able to remove that interference for me. And so I require her expertise again to help me analyze these papers. So for the moment, I'm not sure if the blue pigment in these blued prints is smalt or if it is something else. The prints on blue paper, which I'm showing here, are extremely interesting, as to my knowledge, there is no known set of the Griffiny printed on blue paper. The Griffiny are often an afterthought in literature on Saint-Nom, with many historians taking his own reference to these works as scribbles quite literally and disregarding them as unimportant and of lower quality. The only comprehensive article is a critical catalogue published by Jean de Cailloux in 1964. This article is thorough and immensely useful, but understandably in need of some updating. Cailloux was aware of 11 existing copies of the Griffiny, but had not encountered any on blue paper. I know of at least 20 more copies and have found references to at least another 8 in historic auction catalogues, but again, none are described as being on blue nor blued paper. The prints on blue paper have additional white highlighting, which we also saw in the Fragments album. But in the Fragments album, that white body color has maintained its white color, whereas in this album of the Griffiny, they have all oxidized and turned gray for some yet unknown reason. A further fascinating element of this album are the album pages themselves. And I'm showing you here 25 images of openings in the album that demonstrate how varied every page is. There are 6 different types of paper used, of which 5 are different types of blue paper. There is buff laid paper, variegated dark blue laid paper, variegated medium blue laid paper, variegated duck egg blue wove paper, Prussian blue laid paper, and Prussian blue wove paper. I again used reflectance spectroscopy on the 3 variegated paper, and they're all composed of fibers dyed with indigo tin. And I dubbed the Prussian blue papers thus because the spectroscopy revealed they were both dyed with the synthetic pigment Prussian blue, both those on laid and wove paper. On these album pages, one watermark appears 15 times, and it appears on the buff laid paper, the darker blue variegated laid paper, and Prussian blue laid papers. This mark is the initials DLG, as I have tried to show here on 2 pages. Another watermark appears once on a sheet of Prussian blue wove paper, which is the name Courtelin. In addition, at least 2 of the buff laid papers have embedded blue fibers within their paper structure. It therefore seems that all 6 different types of paper within this album were produced by the same mill, and it must have been the mill at Courtelin in northern France, which was founded in 1767 by Etienne Louis de Lagarde, hence the initials DLG. In 1771, the mill was purchased by Jean-Baptiste Réveillon, a successful maker of papier peint, or pattern wallpaper, of which I am showing some examples here. He specialized in flock wallpaper, which for our topic today in French was known as papier bleu d'Angleterre. For his line of work, he therefore had to be adept in the production of colored papers. He also claimed to be the first in France to produce wove paper, a relatively new invention from across the pond. Although 2 other French papermakers made the same claim, Réveillon came out on top, as he quickly mastered the new technique of producing wove paper, and it was this which helped him obtain the status of royal manufactory for the Courtelin mill. In 1780, Réveillon returned the paper mill to the de Lagarde sons, whom he had trained in the art of papermaking, having no sons of his own. He therefore retained a vested interest in the paper mill. The paper in this album must therefore have been produced under Réveillon's supervision. In light of the wove paper present in the album, the overall effect is that of a papermaker experimenting not only with the novel process of producing wove paper, but of various types of blue paper as well. If we return for one final look at the whole album, it is also clear that the lack of homogeneity extends to the organization, with few pages exhibiting the same layout. We don't know who the original owner of this album was, but the impression is of one experimenting on each folio with alternate arrangements of aquatints printed on 3 different types of papers, including 2 different types of blue paper, and their placement on an album with 6 different types of paper, 5 of which are different types of blue paper. The result is an entirely different visual impression on every opening of the book. In conclusion, this album seems to me a wholly unique object, exhibiting novel experiments on the parts of the printmaker Saint-Non, the papermaker Réveillon, and the anonymous collector who devised the arrangement of the pages, all on different types of blue paper. It remains only for me to extend my thanks to those who have supported my research and to say there are, of course, many unanswered questions that remain, and so I welcome any ideas or information that might be relevant.
Thank you, Rachel. I would like to invite Brad and Armin to join us. We have about 6 minutes for questions. Thank you so much for these fascinating papers. The first questions are related to Brad's talk and to the separate traditions of the use of blue paper in Hebrew publications. So when it comes to the deluxe editions, could you please say anything about how the number of deluxe books compare to those printed on non-blue paper?
Oh, in the first, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. In the first 2 periods of the 3 periods that I discussed, the blue paper copies are only deluxe copies. And even if one does a census of these, one can't normally find more than a few instances of a deluxe copy on blue paper. And in many of the cases, only 1 copy is known. That's why that Bamberg Talmud sold at Sotheby's in 2008 was such a sensation. First of all, it wasn't known even to exist until 100 years ago. And then it was reported in a private collection. It went somewhere in between that private collection to another private collection, and eventually was sold at this sale, but no complete copy on blue paper is known. But it's clear that there must have been 1 complete copy on blue paper because it's a multi-volume work, dozens of tractates, and many of them are preserved in the 1 known copy on blue paper. The same applies to the Amsterdam and Frankfurt an der Oder Talmud editions, where we know of the copies that were commissioned on blue paper, and the whole edition came out on white paper, but someone commissioned a blue paper copy. And I noticed there was a question among the written questions whether the blue paper copies were a matter of status. They sure were, because only very wealthy people could commission copies like that. In the case of David Oppenheim of Prague, the chief rabbi of Prague, he was a relation of just about the richest Jew in Europe at that time, Wertheimer in Vienna. And both he and Wertheimer commissioned blue paper copies of 2 editions of the Talmud, one from Amsterdam, one from Frankfurt an der Oder. And only they could afford to do that. And you may have heard, I mentioned that one of them was printed on large blue paper, 20, whatever the 24 volumes that I say, 24, 27 volumes on large blue paper, not just blue paper, large blue paper. We're talking about an extreme expense, and only a few people could do that, and the printers would only produce 1 or a few copies, usually commissioned ones. But when it came to the 3rd period that I discussed, that was crap paper, and the whole edition was on that paper. And to find a white paper copy of those is what's rare. And we know that there were white paper copies, rare white paper copies prepared for these editions, which are otherwise entirely on low quality blue-ish paper.
Okay.
I hope
Thank you
that
so
more or
much.
less answers.
And just one more question related to the Eastern European tradition. Do you happen to know where the paper was manufactured? And could there have been any kind of restrictions regarding the raw materials that Jewish publishers had access to?
I wish I could answer that with
Okay.
some expertise. As I mentioned, there was an outside observer, the Scottish missionary, who visited print shops in Eastern Europe. He reports on two different printing establishments. He went to one town in Ostrich, which I reproduced there among the illustrations. And he said that the typography was fine. In fact, Ostrich was one of the better printers. The typography was fine, unimpeachable, but the paper, he made a point of saying the paper, and the paper which was used everywhere in the Jewish printing shops was this crap paper. Now I say crap, I don't remember the term that he used, but it was equivalent to that. And according to some sources, but I haven't done enough research in this to know, and I have to yield to paper historians. There were Jews involved in paper making in Eastern Europe at this time. The only more specific information I have is for neighboring Upper Hungary, where we know more about Jews involved in paper making. But all I know is that Jews were said to be involved in paper making in Eastern Europe, in these regions, the regions of these books. But I know nothing more about it. And I'm sure there's literature on that. And if anyone knowledgeable has heard my discussion and wants to advise me, I'd be more than happy to hear about it.
Thank you so much. Moving on to Armin's presentation. I really enjoyed your talk on glow-up prints, and I was quite surprised to hear Gen Z in a presentation on Holtzius. But if you think that many of these prints are reissued prints and post-date Holtzius's involvement in printmaking, how would you characterize Holtzius's use of blue paper in his artistic practice? What remains?
Oh, what remains is
Yes.
the drawings.
Okay.
It's very much the drawings, and they kind of set the kind of aesthetic, the aesthetic standard that was basically looked at the time. And we do, on the other hand, it is not that there is no prints printed, in the 16th century. There were sort of presentation copies, which were kind of not by Goltzius, but by Hieronymus Koch published, things like that. So they do actually exist. But those, with Goltzius, we actually really have, especially with the woodcuts, this issue that there is, first of all, an extreme rarity for early impressions, like extreme rarity. This Magdalene that I showed, there's not one impression known from the block before deterioration, which is really kind of astonishing. And then, of course, we have also with Goltzius, even with the engravings, we should not forget that we do actually have clearly a market there after Goltzius dies, when the workshop starts, under Matham's tutelage, probably starts printing even unfinished plates. I mean, this is the first time when we suddenly have prints that were left unfinished by Goltzius, and then they were actually issued no longer really for the image that they are, but for the artifice that they were, for a masterpiece of, even if it was an incomplete masterpiece of printmaking. And I think this whole sort of cult and kind of specialization of the object very much comes out of that time. In a wider range, in the German lands, we have that what was usually called the Dürer Renaissance. All of these kind of glow-up jobs that happen, be it illuminating engravings by Dürer, printing them on silk, doing kind of fancy things like maybe possibly that Hirschvogel on blue paper comes. I think it's sort of it's kind of an early way of sort of an historic appreciation of what has come before. Mm-hmm. And I think for me, sort of it's all a phenomenon of the early 17th century, but not a contemporaneous phenomenon.
Thank you so much. Rachel, just one quick question, because we need to stick to the schedule. Do you have an idea how the album was compiled? Like if there was an organizational principle when the collector put it together? Like, have you noticed any kind of patterns?
Just noticed the lack of pattern. I mean, the original plates, of course, Venice would have all been grouped together, Naples grouped together, and here they're all mixed in together, different subjects, different artists. So to me, it looks more like visually experimenting with how the layouts look rather than actually considering the contents of the prints.
Okay, all right, thank you so much. And perhaps we can return to your presentation later on during the roundtable discussion if there are any more questions. We're going to take a break and we will resume at 11:55 with a roundtable discussion moderated by Katy Gotardo. Thank you so much and see you soon. Welcome back to the roundtable discussion that will conclude our two-day symposium. I'm delighted to introduce Katy Gotardo, the Martin Halusa Senior Curator of Drawings at the Courtauld Gallery, who will be leading the discussion. And I would like to invite all the participants to turn their cameras on and join us here in this virtual space.
Shall I start, Edina? Yes. Well, first of all, I wish to thank you and Michelle and Leila for your invitation. It's been a great honor. It's a great honor for me to moderate this roundtable, and I also wish to congratulate you on selecting such a rich and varied array of speakers. So well done for this, because this has been a very stimulating conference, and the number of attendees I think is quite a proof of this success. As my colleague Rachel Haponieno mentioned, Edina and Michelle ran a two-day workshop at the Courtauld earlier in the year, during which we looked at many of our blue paper drawings, and we learned a lot, and much of what we learned informed our current display, which Rachel has curated. So perhaps the way I want to kick off to start this roundtable would be to ask a very basic question. Why has there been such a strong interest in recent years in material studies, in particular on blue paper? And can we actually pinpoint this beginning to coincide with a publication, a scientific investigation that has sort of started to really create a buzz around this type of research? The culmination was the most recent culmination was the Getty exhibition and the publication, which many of the speakers these days have pointed out how that publication has been really instructive for their research. But from some of the papers today, especially, this research started a few years ago, if I think, for example, at the Ottavio Leoni drawings in Berlin. So, yeah, why do you think that there is such a clearly wide interest on this material? And where do you think, if you can say, if someone can say it, where did it all start? And of course, with the creation of the Blue Paper Consortium, in which Leila Sauvage is very much involved. Does anyone wish to talk, to say something?
I can start, maybe, Katy, and then I saw Edina's hand. Yeah, because you just mentioned the Blue Paper Research Consortium. I think that was interesting because as a conservator, there are publications that date from earlier than when we started in 2016. And I was looking for information about, how 18th century blue paper was made for pastel painters. And I was quite surprised how difficult it was when I came to the paper mill asking, okay, how do you make blue paper? And we realized that it was not that straightforward. And as we started looking into that, I thought I was not very well informed, but then looking into different institutes, we realized that no one really knew exactly how it worked. We kind of knew there was indigo, but then no one really tried at a scale that was significant enough to understand whether things would work within a papermaking context or not. And the key for me, I think in 2016, was to meet a dyer to really understand that, because I realized in papermaking we were lacking information about that. So for me, that was the starting point, and we just started to spread the word on what we were doing, and slowly, that's why I'm very interested to see how the little things we found, which were mostly practical, this was really based on the material approach and the experimental archaeological approach that we had then spread out into more structured research projects. So yeah, this for me was a key moment when we were able to start teaching this to other people, because I thought the materiality aspect and the actual making in a paper mill was still lacking. There was a lot of theory, there was a lot of archival sources and research, but not yet connected to an actual practice. That was my starting point, in my opinion.
Yeah, that makes quite sense. It's true that looking through the publications, it's really, as you say, in recent years where you have people who have really deep dived digged in into doing technical research and especially publishing that information. If no one has anything else to add on this, Edina would like to.
Yeah, sorry. So for Michelle and me, looking at a material allows to work across schools and regions within our collection. So it's like a flexible way of doing research. So I think that was the original appeal. And then once we started working on blue paper, we realized that there's relatively little done on this topic, on this material, and oftentimes the same information gets repeated in the literature. But like once you look into it, they turn out to be more like misconceptions or overgeneralized statements. And then finally, working on blue paper as a topic also allows us to place our Western European collection of drawings within a global context. So that's a plus for us.
Yeah, if I can add, that's very true, because I noticed also at the Corto for us, it has been a great chance through the display to bring out different drawings that we would not have really studied by being interested, in fact, in the papers because of the difference of their paper. Armin.
Yeah, just not really as an answer to the question, but just some other thought about it. That it also, one attraction is, of course, it's a little bit of a sideway, as we all stated now. It is so under-researched. So we have about 150 years of watermark research. We have all of those other established categories. We have now the third generation of looking at Rembrandt watermarks or something like that. And it has been done over and over again. And then suddenly you move into a field like that, and you realize there's very little. And then the other thing that is interesting that we actually do have, and actually, I think Brad's talk made this very, very clear, that this is blue paper has this fascinating dichotomy between, on one hand, it is in the 18th century Venetian printing, some of the Jewish printing, it's a luxury object. At the same time, it's also, that cheap blue paper, wrapping paper, where then sort of the imaginative artist sees something for which it wasn't intended, but adapts it. And we actually also have that, for example, Rembrandt's use of something what is called cartridge or oatmeal paper, which was a cheap wrapping paper, but he kind of liked that. And you have that in late 18th century England, where printers and actually also draftsmen start to use a very, very fibrous paper, which was clearly not meant for fine art drawing, but it was meant like for other things, like to kind of wrap things. And then they see a certain quality on it. And sort of blue paper encompasses both. Is on one hand, it can be a luxurious object, material. At the same time, it can also be a very common material, because for various reasons that the conservators know much better, it's sort of easier to produce. Some of it might have been cheaper. It doesn't have to be bleached, all of those kind of aspects.
Yeah, and in fact, you brought up two sort of issues or subjects that I wanted to touch upon. One was what we sort of heard across the 2 days. Blue paper was very cheap. Blue paper was of good quality. This blue paper is of bad quality. So can we maybe establish that we should top categorizing them generally, that actually probably there was a production of cheap and not so fine blue paper, but also there was one that was clearly used for like print making, for example, for printing, book printing, that was maybe of a finer type because it had to answer those needs. And the other also subject that you raised that came to mind was, where should all these studies lead? And the fact that you mentioned, for example, the studies of watermarks or the collector's marks, it sort of made me think, should there be a repository where all these actually studies and results of your investigations should come together, so that actually there is a proper place where everyone can sort of look at that in the future for every time that they will study this subject. And Edina, you have your hand raised.
I'm going to answer your first question regarding the quality and cost of blue paper. I mean, I think it's very important to emphasize that during the early modern period in Western Europe, blue paper was produced in various qualities and it was sold at various costs. And there's this idea that, you know, blue paper was cheap and it was a wrapping material that keeps getting repeated in the literature, and it can be traced back to this one late 14th century source that states that blue paper that is sold in Bologna is cheaper than the white paper, but people fail to mention that there's also a third type of paper mentioned in this document that is even cheaper than blue paper. So yes, it was cheaper than blue paper in the case of that one document, but because we have so few archival sources, that would be an oversimplification. And if you think about later ones, so like dating from the late 16th century, we have inventories that mention different types of blue paper. And so that's why I would avoid it. And I also think we don't have a proper understanding of what quality means in the case of early modern early modern paper, because oftentimes we project our own understanding of high quality paper onto what we see. We disregard how they were manufactured. So I think we need to think a lot more about it, because just because there are inclusions in a paper, it doesn't mean it's low quality and things like that. So sorry.
That's a very good point. And Georg, you have your hand raised.
Yes, thank you, Katie. I wanted to try to answer your second part of the question, so I don't know if the other hands relate to the first half of quality.
Go ahead anyway.
Okay, I just thought when you suggest that database to collect all the data on blue paper would be helpful, I'm absolutely with you, because we saw how vulnerable blue paper is, and I think it would be very helpful to have a place where we could bring together the information about the blue papers, the microfading, to help others who are asking themselves how to exhibit works of art on blue paper. So I think it's a very nice idea.
And then maybe Leila can tell us later whether this is already in preparation. But now, Elizabeth Gralton, please.
This is actually Reba Snyder, who was working on the project with Elizabeth. I just wanted to comment on a couple of things. One is that what we are hoping to do as our survey progresses is to look at our printed books on blue paper and compare them with our drawings paper, because I'm not actually convinced at this point that those papers are substantially different. I think they become different because of the printing process and the pressure used. So that's a piece of data that we're going to be focusing on when we reach our printed books section of this survey. The other sort of small point, which is that we at the Morgan have been attempting very hard to get our watermarks online in our public catalog facing. So whenever we make a beta or any other recording of a watermark on blue or white paper, we try to get it onto our catalog so it's easily available. I know that that's not a centralized point, but it is a place where people can use that information very easily.
Thank you, Reba. And Maria. Oh, we can't hear you, actually. Can you unmute you?
Just wanted to pick up on something Adina was saying about prices. And that's one of the things I was trying sort of more subtly to bring out, that fine blue paper was used to wrap seeds, and that I didn't actually ever find any of this so-called, really coarse blue paper for wrapping seeds. I found almost every other kind of paper, but there is an inventory for the royal household from the 1640s at the Folger. And in that inventory, 6 quires of Dutch paper costs 9 pence, and 6 quires of Dutch blue paper costs 8 pence. So again, this idea that blue paper is so much cheaper. Now, this is probably writing paper because this is a stationary account of household expenses for the royal family. But that's just an indication that, it's shillings. 9 shillings versus 8 shillings. So 1 shilling, less for six quires of blue paper than regular Dutch paper. So it's not a huge price difference.
Thank you. Michelle.
Sure, just on both points, actually, circling back to Adina talking about quality and issues of properties of paper, just to elaborate a little bit, I think in our study, just of the Getty's collection alone, we saw quite a range. We couldn't be very, explicit saying this is all cheap paper. We saw a range in sheet formation, in paper thickness. We had heard repeatedly that blue paper wasn't size. That definitely was not the case in our study, and I think in Layla's experience too. I'd be curious what our other contributors over the last 2 days have experienced in their collection surveys. So just to kind of strengthen that point from our own practical real examination of objects as material evidence. And then the second point has to do with the consolidation of this information. I'm not volunteering us to do that work, but I just wanted to plug that Adina and I are working on a webpage that will be hosted on the Getty site for collecting resources on studying blue paper. So we would be happy to link to any databases that people are compiling, literature, projects like that. This, we hope, will be a home for continued dialogue and exchange on the topic of blue paper.
That's
Please
wonderful.
contribute.
Wow. Yeah, that's wonderful, Michelle, to know this. And now Judith. Oh, Judith is gone.
Back. Sorry, my child just came in. So I wanted to pick up on what Maria was saying about finding those prices. I'm hugely interested, of course. And it kept coming up, right? This question of how cheap it is. And I kept wondering, why are we so intrigued by this being cheap? Who cares? What I really want to know is more about the availability of it. And I think that's something that has puzzled us. And we sort of keep going back to the question of why were artists using this at a specific time or a place or whatever. And I think the greater question that is such a mystery to us, I think almost all, is the availability of different kinds in places, what was manufactured where, etc. But really behind that question is the why of it all. And I think that should actually lead us back right to the artist's decision making. So the more I hear the word cheap, the less interested I'm getting, I guess.
Thank you for that. Armin.
Oh yeah, just briefly as a direct response to Judith, I couldn't agree more. And since I have all of these blue paper experts here together, I just want to pose this public question. Can anyone please give me an idea or a suggestion why Dürer, after he encountered Carta Azzurra in Venice and did beautiful drawings in Venice, never brought a single sheet of blue paper back to Nuremberg? A single sheet. I mean, he brought all kinds of stuff back that Pirkheimer asked him, but we have no evidence of him bringing this back. He actually then laboriously started to prepare paper because he really liked to kind of continue to draw and prepare papers. But this is like, so this kind of huge, big mystery in the Dürer scholarship. But, you know, this is just like a footnote to Judith, what you were saying. Why here and why not there? And even if we take the value out of the question, I just have never really understood that.
It's probably like, why did Rembrandt never use blue paper, even though so many other Dutch artists?
No, not quite, because he did use it when he was in Venice. So that's the thing. If he would have never encountered it.
No, but what I mean is that it's the kind of question that maybe we will never sadly find out unless, and that sort of brings me to the next point. One of the further avenues of research, therefore, besides perhaps also trying to find out whether blue paper was also used in other areas, we've concentrated mainly, let's say, in Western Europe, a little bit Eastern Europe today with Brad, and then also a little bit on the Americas yesterday. But do we think, could there be more research into blue paper used elsewhere, Asia, for example? I have no idea whether there was any production there. And then the other question was, do you know whether more cover research could actually bring out more evidence, or the sources that you've used clearly show that there isn't much that can be found in terms of archives? Anyone wanting to answer this? If not, I can. Oh, yes, Edina.
And Judith was actually.
Sorry, Judith. Then, sorry, I missed that.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, the only thing I kept thinking of is because the logwood in some of the Dutch blue paper is technically, you can just identify it. So it would be interesting to try and see if some of the drawings are actually, especially dated drawings, where we know where they were made quite specifically because of inscriptions, for instance. It would be interesting to see whether we find, for instance, indigo Italian paper in Haarlem at the end of the 16th century, or Dutch paper in France in the 18th century. It will tell us more than the secondary literature that just repeats itself, basically. So I think that would be helpful. But it's technical analysis that I can't do as an art historian.
That's a good point. Thank you. And Edina.
And I agree with Judith, and paper trade is an important avenue of future research. I would also like to add that we need to do more archival research, and as Brad's presentation really well demonstrated, we keep forgetting about Central and Eastern Europe, even when we claim to be working on European material. I personally have not found anything, like any sources before the end of the 18th century regarding the manufacture of blue paper in Central Eastern Europe. So there's a lot more to do, because presumably they were also manufacturing paper there or importing paper. So it would be great to learn more about it. And then the colonial Americas, for instance, and that's where Megan research comes into the picture, and then also South America as well.
Judith, I didn't mean to.
Megan, I think, wanted to add something.
Yeah, I just wanted to offer that I think it's interesting that, as I mentioned yesterday, right, domestic production of blue paper in North America doesn't really begin until after the American Revolution, which temporally sort of puts it in a field that a lot of people who work up to 1800 aren't thinking about. And so I think when you see blue paper in a North American context, it often isn't understood as part of this larger ecosystem of paper. So hopefully we can
Brad?
do something with that.
Yes, Judith, I just wanted to say that I didn't mean to demean cheap crap paper in your eyes or anyone's eyes. It's only because there's such an evident, huge difference between the blue papers used in deluxe printing of the 16th and 17th and mid 18th centuries, and the East European paper that began to be used in the late 18th century on that. I make that distinction, and one has to make that distinction, but I don't mean to demean cheap or I shouldn't have said crap, forgive me, a blue paper. If you saw the books that I'm referring to, you would realize that this is not good paper. Or you would come to the conclusion that the printers were on something, because they couldn't care less what hues, what tints, what variety of different shades of blue, green, yellow, vermilion, whatever, are mixed together in these books completely indifferently. And so that's why I had to make the distinction. I have to make the distinction between deluxe paper of the 16th, 17th, and mid 18th centuries and the paper that was used in Eastern Europe from the end of the 18th into the 19th century. As I said at the very end, there's another phenomenon which is beyond what I discussed here, and that is the light pastel paper, which is more like writing paper that was used in various parts of Europe from the late 18th and especially late 19th century, which forms a different category altogether, if only because it's very thin paper. It's like airmail writing paper, as opposed to thick tinted paper, which is obviously produced by a different process. I'm not a paper historian, and I have no expertise in that. I'm just a lowly bibliographer and can only write about what I see referred to in the literature and what I see in the books themselves. But with respect to artist's paper, that's a completely different field, and I don't mean to impugn the cheaper paper which I see in Eastern Europe, vis-a-vis whatever you're working with in your respective fields.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you very much. Let me give the chance to Judith to reply, since she raised her hand. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to say, dear Brad, no offense was taken. There's plenty of stuff produced in the Netherlands that definitely is crap. But I think what we're all seeing is a wide variation, right, of quality. And the same was true, I think, for Dutch paper. No, I very much appreciated your paper and the breadth of it all.
The thing that I learned,
offense taken.
Thank you. The thing that I learned most from this conference, I have to say, this symposium, is your very scientific categorization of the varieties or the spectrum of colors of blue papers. Because for me, I looked at it only as a non-scientific, non-forensic outsider observing it. But of course, whatever I see is not on your spectrometers and your devices, which can detect and place on a scientific range the various shades. And I constantly saw a whole variety of shades, but you people have expertise in color, and that hasn't been done for the low quality papers in Eastern Europe, though it would be very interesting, especially since you see such a wide range of them, not between books, but within books. And I simply describe it, from the naked eye and whatever color terminology I can think up as an outsider. But I'm very impressed with your scientific classification and spectrum of hues, of colors, that you display in your work on artists' paper.
Thank you, Brad. Can I just move on simply because sorry to cut you through, but to give time also to other people. Leila.
Yes, I just wanted to react on something that appeared in the Q&A, and I completely agree, is that maybe there's also something we have not looked enough into, I think, is what textile conservators and historians of textile and fashion might know, because I learned personally a lot with the few exchanges I had, and I think we are strongly related to that, and it might be good to connect with this group of researchers.
Megan, you want
Yeah,
to
I
add?
think just as a final comment, another area that I've seen blue paper popping up as I'm looking at things is in the decorative arts and in furniture. So as a liner for furniture, it's sort of being applied in colonial North America. And so furniture studies in blue paper, I think, has a future as well.
Thank you, Megan. And yes, Courtney Wilder had asked that question, and which I thought was very, very interesting and precisely going in that direction. There is also in the Q&A a comment, probably more than a question from Celine Secondo regarding paper used in France in the 18th century, which you would all have read by now. Is there anyone who would like to answer to that? I just want to add to Celine, that I wonder whether it's actually just France or it's more 18th century full stop, because, for example, Zanetti in Venice publishes Parmigianino prints on blue paper. And England, there is such a huge we saw it in our collection, and Rachel, do step in, how many blue paper drawings there is for British drawings. So I do wonder whether this is not just Rococo artistic taste just in France, but a little bit broader. But that just a thought. So Leila, did you have your hand raised? Did you want to add anything? No. And then Deborah have found several manuscripts written on blue paper in California Mission Archives, late 18th century, early 19th centuries. Some of them include recipes and medical treatises. Do you know how common was the use of blue paper in Spanish America? Does someone want to answer this? And then maybe I'll let Rachel answer on the previous comment question. So do you know how common was use of blue paper in Spanish America? No. So someone else to study
file
that,
that under future
that.
avenues.
Exactly, those famous future avenues. Rachel, did you want to add anything?
I was just thinking Celine's comment, I think she was particularly focusing on how blue paper was the preferred support for pastel artists in particular, which was not restricted to France, but essentially very popular in France. And then English artists quickly decided to abandon pastel because of the association with France. And so, of course, we do see it being used in England at the same time, primarily more for different, just for figure studies rather than the pastel that the French artists are using it for.
Sure, thank you. And then Peng Peng Wang, a question for Michelle, I guess. I don't know if you read it. You mentioned yesterday the antibacterial pest repellent properties of blue paper, especially wood blue paper. Is there any research on this topic?
There are, and actually I was just trying to pull up some references, so maybe I can pop some things in the chat to kind of answer that question, some bibliography.
Judith, sorry, question for Judith, I think. Yeah, Valeria Orlandini. During presentation, you mentioned blue paper supports that logwood dyes were used. Do you know what type of logwood has been applied to manufacture blue paper? I'm referring to the recipes given in Ainsworth Mitchell book entitled Inks, Their Composition, 1937. You're probably reading it with me, so would you like to answer Judith or anyone else?
Yeah, I'll keep it brief because I'm not sure how interesting this is for a very wide audience. But I've described it as the hemotoxin Copaceanen. But again, there's a little bit of confusion on it as well, because the question is are there any sources about this? But I haven't found those. So allegedly, the local people who ran these mills kept it a secret, this recipe. It wasn't written down anywhere. So the only way to really do it is to technically analyze or to look at later recipes. And I think that's what the book is referring to as well, slightly later. But I'm not entirely clear on that. But I'll leave it to that. I did see that Stephanie Schrader had an interesting question about the reason for Rembrandt not using the blue paper. And I've always understood it as Rembrandt is interested in gritty details. He's etching a lot, for instance, but the blue paper really is advised by Karel van Mander and also Rembrandt's pupil, Simon van Hoogstraten, really to smoothen out modeling and to do that and use that middle tone for that, which would later become known as a sort of an academic enterprise. And Rembrandt was against that. But more on that by Erik Jan Sluiter and also the Rembrandt's Naked Truth exhibition catalog. Not the end of the story, but there might be beginning there.
Yeah, precisely. I think that was very, very interesting observation from Armin, and where, who knows, future archival findings, research could answer or partly answer that, because yeah, it's quite interesting in both cases that Rembrandt didn't pick it up, perhaps for the reason you suggested, Judith, and how Dürer behaved. Okay, so 8:31 here. So Armin, one last comment, and Maya, and then we should wrap up.
Maya, you want to go first? Because I kind of like talked a lot already.
Yeah, sure. I just had a tiny something to add about the logwood, actually. I made some cotton linter paper pulp last week and dyed it with logwood as part of this paper making workshop that we gave. And yeah, so it made me, I do also have this similar question of the mordant, but also in terms of the infrastructure of paper mills at the time and how they would have been, with which, I mean, my understanding is, I guess, that iron mordant makes it bluer, but that, with what kind of mordant, and then infrastructure for like rinsing and heating and all of those kinds of questions that, I feel like are probably more technical than what we have, time for here, but I would love to keep talking about, should anyone be interested.
Thank you, Maya. And Armin.
Yeah, I just actually have I'm not talking about Rembrandt now. I just have a totally different comment to make. It's a shout out to the Basel team, in case they're still awake and still there. Because they did this amazing, PCA program of getting the all color back. And while I was watching it, and I thought, this is all kind of very interesting, but what can we get from that? And so what I wanted to suggest is, or what the idea that I just came up with is, it is actually fascinating because I think it could, or maybe that's more a question, don't we think that it actually could add and help us in classical connoisseurship, i.e. attribution? What I mean is, if you actually have a drawing where, say, the white heightening has been totally oxidized, it's very difficult to get a judgment even about the quality of the drawing because it's so disfigured. So the same is actually here. So the moment if you actually bring a blue paper drawing, sort of at least visually, digitally, back to its original thing, in case there is a question of attribution, not in this case study that they had, but I thought this could be actually something where, by improving and bringing some of the visual quality of the piece, at least digitally, back to the original, might actually help, in that fuzzy area, the not precise analytical area that all the the paper conservators do, but just kind of help that area, the connoisseur, to say, well, this could actually be by Boucher, although it always been dismissed as some kind of like, workshop piece or copy, maybe just because it looks so horrible because the paper is sharp to have, just as an idea.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And actually the flip side, for example, we looked at one drawing a few months ago when Adina and Michelle were in London, where actually after 2 days of blue paper brainstorming, we realized that the paper that we were looking at could possibly not be late 15th century, and therefore that drawing must have been later, which is possibly a subject that we will investigate further. I think that we should wrap up here, and I wish to thank Michelle, Edina, and Leila for really organizing this incredibly stimulating, interesting symposium. And I pass on the microphone to them if they want to add anything, and big thanks from me.
Yes, thank you, Katie. I think I was in charge of concluding this wonderful 2 evenings for me, 2 mornings, 2 afternoons for everyone. A big thank you to everyone for making this online symposium possible. The speakers, of course, the audience at the Getty, the AV team who's behind all this going so smoothly, the drawings department, the paper conservation department, the public program department, and the conservation training program at the University of Amsterdam. I see that some of my students are still awake. Just going back again to 2016, when I came back again to Jacques Bréjou at the Moulin du Verger, and I asked him for those reconstructions of 18th century blue paper, his answer was yes, of course, you'll get it next week. I'm still waiting for the perfect 18th century paper reconstructions. It probably does not exist as a single sheet, but I think as a variety of papers, and this has shown through the conference. I realized that this was just the beginning of a project that is still ongoing, and so many questions remain to investigate to understand the materiality of blue paper. I'm very thrilled to see how various research groups have addressed this topic, and I think this symposium just only gave a glimpse of possible approaches of the same topic, blue paper. There's definitely interest. We had about 300 attendees over the 2 last days. Now 171 are still awake. Thank you for that. Throughout the symposium, we navigated between art history, history in the broad sense, conservation, science, botany, between textile and paper, between art and trade, and so forth. These are real connections across disciplines, and I think they are necessary to understand the artistic and non-artistic uses of blue paper. The technical case studies that we've seen and the ongoing projects will bring valuable information about the materiality of blue paper, again, across the world and across the centuries. I will just conclude with some questions that I noticed were raised during the symposium, just as a food for thoughts and hopefully a continuation. There's a clear need for more research. I think we all agree on that. Topics that came back are indeed the questions of what are these concepts of qualities and prices for blue paper? Are they relevant depending on the corpus we study? Are there any differences between printing and drawing blue paper? What about color perception and color shift? This came back quite often. First of all, how do we measure it? Is there only one method? But what does it mean for us as a broad group of researchers interested in blue paper? How can we understand this color shift through time, and what is basically the impact on our understanding of the uses of blue paper? And what do we do with all this information? How do we include that in maybe catalogs? We heard about databases, websites, webinars. How do we transform that information? A few things also came back. Of course, transcultural exchanges. So there are, I think, still a lot of things to look into: chronological and geographical connections versus also local developments. We've seen that some artists do pick up things and bring it with them. Some people just use something in a specific location at a given time. This is also probably related to the production of blue paper. Where was it produced exactly? And we've seen that some areas of this world are still under investigated. What are the connections between the different professionals involved in paper trade, textile trade, dye trades? What are all these trading routes? So just to finish up, the future avenues for research, what I've noticed from the roundtable, the why, I think, came back quite often. Why was blue paper used? Why in a given time? by specific people in a specific location or not. Uses of blue paper in other parts of the world that are understudied. So we noticed Spanish Americas and other parts of the world. Paper trade is something that is studied for other types of papers, but not yet for blue paper. So why not going into that? Feeding in from more archival and material-based research. I think that's really the key. And this, I think, can only happen if we collaborate with different fields. So we mentioned textile conservation and history, dyes history. We mentioned furniture traditions in different cultures. And then it was interesting to see how the scientific tools and approaches are now infusing the field. So we heard about using, for example, MFT as a way to investigate the discoloration and the stability of blue papers. And the other hand is, how do we use the scientific tools to maybe be better into the art connoisseurship for blue paper specifically? So I thought that was interesting. One thing that I think Edina and Michelle will contribute with the Getty is how to facilitate opportunities to work together, how to make sure that the information is easy to find. So I think in the coming weeks, you will hear about how this will be tackled by the Getty. The idea being trying to find a place where information can be found and connected. So in this regard, do not hesitate to reach out to Edina, Michelle, and myself for suggestions, ideas, and questions. And I'll just finish off by saying thank you all for joining the Drawn to Blue online symposium. Please keep an eye on the Getty website and your emails for the recordings of most of the talks. And thank you all for joining.